The radio crackled once, then went dead. 17 men. One canyon. No extraction. They had spent 3 weeks calling her dead weight, told her to stay back, stay quiet, stay out of the way. Captain Lena Carter did not argue. She had learned a long time ago that the men who talked loudest about who belonged on a battlefield were usually the ones who had never truly fought on one. Now the canyon walls were bleeding smoke, and the operators who had laughed at her assignment were lying in the dirt, punctured, broken, drowning in their own blood. And every single one of them was looking at her. If this story grips you from the very first second, follow my channel so you never miss what comes next. Hit like and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. The drive from Billings to Fort Redstone took 4 hours through country that didn't care if you lived or died. Lena had made that kind of drive before, through Kandahar, through the Korangal, through a stretch of Syrian highway where the burned-out shells of civilian trucks sat rusting on the shoulder like monuments to bad decisions. Montana felt almost peaceful by comparison. Almost. The mountains had a specific kind of indifference to them, the way they pushed down against the horizon and refused to move. She liked that. She had always understood things that refused to move. Her orders had arrived 11 days ago. Temporary attachment to Task Force Ironclad, Fort Redstone installation, duration unspecified. The paperwork called her a combat nurse. It did not say much else. It never did. She drove a civilian rental, a gray Tacoma with 60,000 miles on it, and a passenger seat stacked with medical journals she wasn't going to read. She had already read them. She read everything. That was the thing about being underestimated for long enough. You either stopped trying or you became the most prepared person in any room you walked into. Lena had never been good at stopping. Fort Redstone materialized out of the tree line at dusk, a collection of low concrete buildings and razor wire pressed against the base of a granite ridgeline that the locals called Widow's Peak, though the Army maps listed no such name. The main gate had 2 guards who checked her credentials 3 times before waving her through with the particular suspicion reserved for people who showed up alone and didn't explain themselves. She parked in the lot outside the admin building and sat for a moment with the engine off, listening to the metal tick as it cooled. Okay, she thought. Here we go. Colonel Marcus Hale did not stand when she entered his office. He was a man built like a load-bearing wall, broad, square, and utterly convinced of his own structural necessity. He had the kind of jaw that had probably served him well in every evaluation board he'd ever sat before, and the kind of eyes that measured everything against a standard he'd decided on 20 years ago and hadn't reconsidered since. He looked at her orders. Then he looked at her. Then he looked at her orders again. "Combat nurse," he said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite a greeting either. "Yes, sir. I requested a forward surgical team, not a single attachment." "I'm aware of what you requested." He set the paperwork down very slowly. "You're aware." "Headquarters made the determination, Colonel. I'm here to support the task force however I can." Hale leaned back. The chair complained. "Captain Carter, I run a Ranger task force. We operate in austere environments, extended isolation, often under fire. My operators don't need someone alongside them who's going to require additional protection. They need someone who can keep up." "I can keep up." "That's what everyone says." She didn't respond to that. She had learned which arguments were worth having on day 1. Hale studied her for another moment. Whatever he decided, he kept it to himself. "Sergeant Major Doyle will show you to your quarters. Orientation at 0600. Don't be late." "I won't be." She was halfway to the door when he spoke again, not unkindly, but not warmly either. "The team doesn't want you here, Captain. I'm telling you that up front, so you're not surprised when you feel it." Lena paused. "I appreciate the honesty, sir. It's not meant to be kind. It's meant to save time." She nodded once and walked out. The barracks assigned to her were at the far end of the installation, adjacent to the motor pool. Not the worst quarters she'd ever had. Not the best. She'd slept in worse places, a mud brick corner of a casualty collection point in Helmand Province, for instance, with mortar rounds walking toward her position and a tourniquet on a kid who was 19 years old and kept asking her if his legs were still attached. They were. She told him 3 times until he believed her. She unpacked methodically. Medical kit first, always. Then personal gear. Then the single photograph she carried. Not of family, not of anyone who would worry about her. Just a landscape, a stretch of mountain in a country she would never name, taken on a disposable camera during a deployment that no official record placed her in. She pinned it above the desk and sat down and did not sleep for a long time. Morning formation revealed the rest of Task Force Ironclad. There were 42 operators, Rangers mostly, plus a handful of additional assets and support personnel. They were in good shape, well-equipped, and moved with the particular economy of men who had spent a long time learning not to waste energy. They glanced at her the way you glanced at something that didn't belong, briefly, dismissively, without curiosity. Team leader staff. Sergeant Ethan Briggs introduced himself by not introducing himself. He walked past her during the briefing setup, stopped, looked her rank insignia, looked her face, and then said to the man beside him, loud enough to carry, "Hey, Torres, they really sent us a nurse." The man named Torres, short, compact, with a scar cutting through one eyebrow, smirked. "Headquarters loves us." "She gonna take our temperatures? Maybe give us our flu shots." Lena did not look up from the map she was studying. Briggs seemed mildly disappointed by this. He had the energy of a man who enjoyed reactions, who calibrated his cruelty against the responses he provoked. When she gave him nothing, he moved on, but she felt his attention stay behind for a half-second longer than it should have. She cataloged him the way she cataloged everything. Injury pattern, likely habits, dominant hand, pain tolerance profile. She couldn't have explained why she did this for everyone she met. It had just become automatic, somewhere along the way. The first week was assessment. Task Force Ironclad ran exercises across the ridgeline terrain above the installation, hostage scenarios, ambush reactions, casualty extractions. Lena was assigned to observe and integrate, which in practice meant she was assigned to stay out of the way while the operators ran their evolutions. She observed. She took notes in a small green notebook nobody else seemed to carry. She mapped the training terrain in her head, drainage gullies, choke points, the exposed saddle between the north and south ridges that anyone with field sense would have identified as a natural kill zone. She noted which operators carried their medical kit on their left hip versus their right, which ones wore their tourniquets on their kit rather than their body, which ones would waste critical seconds if they went down and had to self-treat. She said none of this aloud. On the 4th day, during an ambush reaction exercise, one of the Rangers, a young soldier named Decker, maybe 23 years old, full of the specific recklessness that came from being good at everything, twisted an ankle dropping off a boulder and kept running on it for 40 minutes before admitting it was worse than a sprain. By the time they got him back to the aid station, the joint had swollen badly enough that he needed imaging. Lena was already at the aid station when they brought him in. She examined the ankle while the medic, Specialist Ewan, was still pulling gloves on. "Second-degree lateral ligament sprain," she said. "Probably a partial tear of the anterior talofibular. He needs imaging to rule out a small avulsion, but the presentation is consistent. Wrap, ice, elevation. He can continue limited training if he braces it properly." Ewan stared at her. "I was going to say the same thing." "I know. I just said it faster." Ewan blinked. Then quietly, "You want to do the wrap or should I?" "You do it. He'll trust it more coming from you." That was the other thing about being underestimated. You learn to root around pride, get the outcome, don't need the credit. Briggs found a new angle in the second week. He had apparently decided that ignoring her wasn't satisfying enough, so he escalated to direct interference. During casualty exercises, he would redirect medical scenarios away from her, telling his men to work with Ewan, to call for the battalion surgeon, to handle it themselves. He narrated her presence like a continuous, low-grade editorial. "Medical's gonna set up back here," he'd say over the radio during exercises. "Rear echelon, where it's safe." Or, to his team before a patrol, leave a radio with the nurse in case she needs to call for help. The operators who worked closest to Briggs adopted his tone the way soldiers adopted everything from their team leader, gradually, unconsciously, until it felt like their own opinion. Lena absorbed it. She did not complain. She did not report it. She filed it the way she filed everything. in the part of her mind that was still keeping score, not out of bitterness, but out of a professional habit of knowing exactly who she was dealing with. Colonel Hale watched all of this from a remove. He said nothing. She suspected he was deciding something. On day 9, she found a small problem that nobody else had noticed yet. During a logistics review, she flagged that the task force's blood product supply for extended operations was critically low. The installation had been drawing from the same forward medical cache for 3 rotations without replenishment, and the reserve stock had degraded. Temperature variance in the storage unit, a compressor issue that had apparently been reported and not fixed. She wrote a memo. She sent it through the proper channels. It came back with a note. Supply matter under review. No action required at this time. She resubmitted it with additional clinical data attached. That one got no response at all. 3 days later, she walked to the supply sergeant's office herself, waited outside for 20 minutes until he finished a call, and then very calmly explained the specific physiological consequences of attempting to treat hemorrhagic shock with degraded blood products. She included, by name, the likely mortality outcomes for specific injury profiles. The compressor was fixed by the following morning. Nobody thanked her. Nobody connected the fix to her request. The supply sergeant filed the work order under routine maintenance. She went back to her green notebook and kept taking notes. Though the mission brief came at 1800 on a Tuesday. The operations center felt different when it was running live intelligence. A particular kind of quiet underneath all the noise, like a wire pulled tight. Lena took a seat near the back, where she'd been told to sit, and watched the S2 captain walk through the targeting package. 3 American contractors had been seized 11 days ago while conducting infrastructure survey work in a region of the Montana backcountry that had become a hub for a particularly violent militia organization. The FBI had the lead on the investigation, but the tactical action had been handed to the military after the intelligence picture confirmed the hostages were being moved through increasingly remote terrain. Task Force Ironclad would conduct a direct action mission, locate, identify, and recover the hostages, extract intact, minimize civilian casualties. The terrain package was brutal. The target area sat inside a canyon system roughly 40 kilometers northeast of the installation, granite walls, limited helicopter landing zones, single viable ground access route along a ridgeline road that would have to serve as both insertion and exfiltration path. Lena studied the maps. She noted the road. She noted the canyon geometry. She noted the weather projections, a front moving in from the northwest, dropping temperatures and increasing the likelihood of freezing rain. She raised her hand. Briggs looked at her like she'd suggested something obscene. "Captain Carter," Colonel Hale said, neutrally. "The exfil route." She stood, pointed at the map. "This road here, coming out of the canyon, there's a drainage bridge about 2 kilometers from the primary access point. If the temperature drop is as significant as the weather package suggests, that bridge surface is going to ice. One vehicle slipping on that bridge blocks the entire ground extraction route. If we lose that bridge, we lose our only way out." The room was quiet. Briggs leaned forward. "With respect, sir, that's exactly the kind of concern you run a risk mitigation brief for. We've reviewed the ground route. It's viable." "It's viable until it's not," Lena said. She wasn't being combative. She was being precise. "Did anyone ask for the nurse's assessment of the exfil plan?" "Briggs." Hale's voice had an edge to it. "Sir, I'm just saying, this is a tactical planning discussion. The medical attachment doesn't typically—" "She's an officer, Sergeant. In this room, she speaks." The silence had a specific texture now, something between discomfort and resentment. Briggs sat back, but his jaw was doing something. Hale looked at Lena. "Your concern is noted, Captain. S3. Run an alternate exfil assessment based on the weather projection. Mark the bridge as a contingency risk." "Yes, sir." "Anything else?" She looked at the map for another second. "Casualty collection point. The canyon floor is the obvious choice, but the walls are going to funnel any engagement noise and make coordinating medical evolutions extremely difficult in a firefight. I'd recommend establishing a secondary CCP about 300 meters back toward the mouth of the canyon, near the rock outcropping on the west wall. Better cover, better sightlines, more accessible for Casevac if we lose the birds." The S4 started writing something down. Hale studied her. That's a sound recommendation. Add it to the OPORD. Briggs said nothing, but when the brief broke up and the operator started filing out, he moved close enough to her that she could hear him clearly without him having to raise his voice. "You're going to get someone killed," he said, "trying to be something you're not on a live op." She met his eyes. "I know exactly what I am, Sergeant. The question is whether you know what you are." He walked away. She stood there for a moment, alone in the operations center, looking at the canyon map. 40 kilometers, she thought. One road in, one road out. She was already thinking about what she'd need if things went wrong, how much she could carry, what she'd have to improvise, the specific procedures for the injuries most common to canyon ambush scenarios. She went back to her quarters and packed her medical kit for the 4th time, organizing it the way she always organized it, not by protocol, but by the sequence in which she expected to need things. They departed at 0200 in a column of 4 vehicles, 2 MATVs, a lighter utility truck carrying communications equipment, and a trailing vehicle with the medical and logistics load that Lena shared with Ewan, and 2 additional rangers assigned to security. The night was cold and getting colder. Briggs was in the lead vehicle. She could hear his voice occasionally on the radio, clear, confident, the cadence of a man who had done this enough times that routine felt like control. She understood that feeling. She had felt it herself, once, in a different life, before she understood that routine was the thing you had to break free of the moment. Everything stopped being routine. The canyon road was worse than the satellite imagery suggested. The canyon road was always worse than the satellite imagery suggested. It was barely wide enough for the MATVs, with a stone wall on the left and a drop-off on the right that the headlights couldn't reach the bottom of. The surface had the particular texture of a road that had been repaired several times by people who didn't care about doing it right. Patches over patches, gravel in the cracks, edges that crumbled when the vehicle weight pushed outward. Lena sat in the back of the trailing vehicle with her kit across her knees and watched the canyon walls through the window. The temperature had dropped 12 degrees since they left the installation. She could feel it in the air coming through the vehicle's inadequate heating system, a dry, sharp cold that bit at the edges of exposed skin. "Bridge coming up," the driver said. She felt the vehicle slow, felt the transition from gravel road to concrete deck beneath the tires. She felt, not heard, not quite, but felt, through the vehicle body, something different in the way the surface texture responded. "Ice," she said. "What?" "Ice on the bridge deck. Tell the lead element to slow down." The driver hesitated. That half-second of hesitation, the radio crackled. From somewhere ahead, a sound that wasn't radio noise. Then the night lit up. The explosion came from the east wall of the canyon. Not a single detonation, but a sequence, like a string of firecrackers scaled up by several orders of magnitude. The pressure wave hit the vehicle before the sound did, and then the sound arrived like a wall falling over. The driver swore. The vehicle slewed right, and the gunner above them dropped back into the hatch, shouting something Lena couldn't parse through the ringing in her ears. She was already moving. "Ewan!" She grabbed his arm. "Stay low. Wait for the vehicle to stop moving." The vehicle stopped. It had gone partway off the road, right rear tire dropping into the drainage ditch beside the shoulder. Not overturned. Drivable if they could get back on the road surface. On the radio, multiple voices, all at once, all of them saying different things. None of it good. She heard Hale's voice cutting through. "All elements, report status." Then Briggs, and his voice was different now. The confidence was still there, but underneath it was something she recognized, something she had heard in 100 different accents and languages over the years. It was the voice of someone who had just looked at a situation and understood for the first time that they were not in control of it. "Sierra 1 is down. Lead vehicle. We've got casualties. Canyon wall came down on the road. We're blocked in." The exfil route. The bridge. The road. Everything she had flagged. "How many casualties?" Hale demanded. A pause that was too long. "Sierra 1, how many casualties?" "We're still counting, sir." Briggs's voice, quieter now. There's a lot of people down." Lena was already out of the vehicle, kit on her back, moving toward the front of the column at a low run. The canyon had swallowed the night. Smoke poured from the kill zone in thick, oily ropes, rising and catching in the stone walls and pooling overhead like a ceiling. Somewhere ahead, she could hear the specific kind of yelling that came from men trying to maintain tactical discipline while their bodies were registering that something catastrophic had just happened. And underneath all of it, underneath the radio noise and the distant secondary detonations and the echo of the initial blast still bouncing off the granite, she could hear the sound she knew better than almost any other sound in the world. Men in serious medical distress. She moved through the smoke. She passed a ranger sitting against the canyon wall with his hand pressed against the side of his neck and his eyes very wide. She stopped, pulled a hemostatic dressing from the outermost pocket of her kit, applied it directly, guided his hand over it. Pressure. Hard. Don't let go. He nodded. She moved on. The lead MATV had been pushed sideways against the canyon wall by the blast, its windshield gone, its roof partially collapsed. The second vehicle was stopped 50 meters back, largely intact but surrounded by operators who had dismounted and were trying to establish a perimeter and simultaneously render aid. Two things that were very hard to do at the same time, in the dark, in a canyon, with someone still potentially shooting at them. She counted bodies as she moved, not dead, wounded, slumped, crawling, being dragged by teammates. She reached Briggs at the front of the column. He was kneeling beside one of his men, a big ranger named Gallagher, who was breathing in a way that told her immediately what the problem was. Briggs looked up. In the smoke and the dark and the chaos, his face had lost everything performative about it. Carter. Just her name. Nothing else. She dropped beside Gallagher and her hands were already moving before she spoke. Tension pneumothorax, left side. The blast had done something to his chest, probably a fractured rib punching inward, probably a seal that his body had already broken trying to compensate. I need a decompression needle, 14 gauge. My kit, outer right pocket. Outer right pocket, red tag. She felt Briggs moving behind her, heard the zip of the pocket. Got it. Hand it to me. The needle was in her hand and then it was in the correct intercostal space. Second intercostal, mid-clavicular line. The kind of placement that took either training or desperation, and she had both. And the hiss of released pressure was one of the better sounds she had heard all night. Gallagher's breathing changed immediately. Still labored. Better. She moved to the next man. From somewhere in the smoke, she heard Colonel Hale's voice on the radio. And his voice had changed too, in the specific way that command voices changed when the tactical picture had outrun the plan. Medical, this is actual. How many can you handle? She keyed her radio without stopping her hands. Tell me how many I've got, sir. A pause. Actual is still assessing. Then I'll assess myself. She raised her voice over the noise. UN, on me. Torres, you're my runner. You go where I point. Everybody else who's still standing, listen to me. The canyon walls threw her voice back at her in overlapping echoes. Somewhere in the dark, men stopped what they were doing. She said, anyone not actively shooting at someone, you're medical support right now. Find me the worst ones first. Nobody argued. Not even Briggs. He just picked up the next injured man and carried him toward her without being asked. She worked. The smoke was everywhere and the cold was getting worse, and somewhere above the canyon walls, the weather system she had flagged in the planning brief was fully arriving. Freezing rain just beginning to spit down through the gaps in the smoke, hitting the canyon floor in a way that made the footing treacherous, and the temperature feel even more malicious than the numbers suggested. 17 men. She counted them twice in the first terrible minutes because she needed the number in her head. 17 operators in various states of injury ranging from the man with the neck wound, serious but manageable with good pressure, to Gallagher with his chest, to two others she could already see were going to need interventions she had never expected to perform on a canyon floor in the dark. 17. She made a decision that she didn't have time to second guess. She divided them. Walking wounded. Get to the west wall. Sit down. Hands on your injury. Someone stays with you, rotates through checking pressure on your dressings. She pointed at 3 operators who were still mobile. You 3. You're my litter teams. You move when I tell you to move. You move who I tell you to move. Clear? Clear, said one of them, a sergeant whose name tape read OKN Cabwo. Ewan. She looked at her medic, who was already on one knee beside a man with a leg wound. Hemorrhage control on the bilateral casualties. Start with the worst bleed. Call out when you're stable. Ewan nodded. His hands were already inside the wound. She turned to the next man. Boto. The radio told her in fragments what was happening outside the immediate radius of her hands. Air evacuation was offline. The weather system had moved faster than projected. Ceiling too low, visibility too poor, the nearest medevac assets unable to clear the ridgeline without instrument approaches that nobody had cleared for this canyon. Ground reinforcement was coming, but the rockfall had blocked the canyon road. A combat engineering element had been dispatched from Fort Redstone, but their ETA was being measured in hours, not minutes. Hours. She heard this and she calculated, the way she always calculated. Resources against requirements against time. What she had, the equipment she had packed, what Ewan carried, what was in the vehicle medical load, plus whatever she could improvise from the logistics truck and the Rangers' individual first aid kits. What she needed, blood products she didn't have in adequate quantity, surgical tools for 2 interventions that required a forward surgical team, and a warm environment that simply did not exist. What she had to work with was what she had. She worked. The canyon got colder, the rain got worse, and Lena Carter moved from man to man in the dark, her hands sure and her voice steady and her mind running the kind of calculations that most people never had to run, in the specific silence that lived beneath all the noise. The silence of someone who had decided a long time ago that she was not going to let people die if she could stop it. Briggs appeared at her shoulder at one point. She wasn't sure how much time had passed, maybe 40 minutes into it, with his tactical light held at the right angle to illuminate her work without blinding her. She didn't say anything. He didn't either. He just held the light. 17 men. The snow began somewhere between the second and third hour. Light at first, just flurries that dissolved before they hit the canyon floor, and then heavier, accumulating in the cracks between rocks and on the shoulders of the men who were waiting for her to reach them. She reached all of them. She did not think about the cold or the dark or what was going to happen when morning came, and she had to account for what she'd used and what she'd improvised and whether any of it was going to hold. She thought about the next man, and then the one after that. When the combat engineers finally broke through the rock fall at the canyon mouth, 4 hours and 17 minutes after the ambush, the lead vehicle's crew had marked the time automatically, force of habit, the Army's reflex for documentation. The scene they drove into was nothing like anything they had been briefed to expect. The canyon floor had been converted in the space of those 4 hours into something that looked less like a disaster site and more like a field hospital that had been assembled by someone who knew exactly what they were doing. The injured men were positioned according to priority. The walking wounded were sheltered from the wind. Dressings were on, tourniquets were marked with time of application, chest seals were holding, and the 2 men who had needed the most intervention were stable. Not well, not safe, but alive and stable and breathing. Colonel Hale had ridden with the engineers. He stepped out of the vehicle and stood in the canyon, looking at what had been done, and didn't speak for a long moment. Then he looked for Lena. She was on her knees beside the last casualty, the man with the neck wound, who had developed a secondary complication she'd been managing for the last 90 minutes. She was still working. She hadn't stopped. Hale watched her for a moment. Then he looked at Briggs, who was standing 3 feet away, holding a flashlight, still providing illumination without being asked. Briggs met his colonel's eyes. Neither of them said anything, but somewhere in that exchange, something shifted. The evacuation took another 2 hours. Medevac helicopters cleared the ridgeline at first light, the weather system having moved far enough east to open a narrow corridor. The injured went out in order of priority. The walking wounded followed. Lena rode out last. She sat in the back of the helicopter with her kit on her lap, and her hand still marked with the work she'd been doing for the last 6 hours. The medic beside her, someone from the medevac crew, a young specialist who kept glancing at her, finally said, "How many?" She looked at him. "How many did you bring out?" She thought about the question, about what it meant to answer it correctly. 17, she said. The specialist nodded, looked out the door at the canyon disappearing below them. 17, he said again quietly, like he was trying to understand the number. She leaned her head back against the bulkhead. The mountain light was just beginning to come in through the open door, gray and cold and entirely indifferent, the way Montana morning light always was. She closed her eyes. She did not think about the debrief waiting at Fort Redstone, did not think about the questions that were already queued up, how she had known what she knew, how she had done what she had done, how a combat nurse had run a field hospital in a canyon with no resources and no backup and no option to fail. Those questions were coming. She had answered versions of them before. For now, she let the helicopter noise fill the space where thought usually lived, and she breathed the cold mountain air coming through the door, and she did not yet think about what would happen when certain people started pulling at certain threads in certain personnel files. Because when they did, when they found what was behind the sections marked with clearances above Colonel Hale's pay grade, the questions were going to get a great deal more complicated. The debrief room at Fort Redstone smelled like bad coffee and accountability. Lena had been in rooms like this before, different buildings, different installations, different branches of a bureaucracy that ultimately processed everything the same way. Questions first, conclusions second, blame somewhere in the middle. She sat at the near end of a folding table with a legal pad in front of her that she hadn't written anything on, and she waited while the people across from her arranged their documents and tried to decide how to begin. There were 4 of them. Colonel Hale at the head, the Task Force S2, a lean captain named Price, who had the specific posture of someone who believed information was power and hoarded both. The battalion surgeon, Major Aldrich, who had driven up from the main post at Billings and who kept looking at his phone in a way that suggested he'd rather be somewhere else. And an officer she didn't recognize, a JAG captain from the insignia, who was present for reasons that hadn't been explained to her. The JAG officer's presence was the detail that concerned her most. JAG didn't show up to medical debriefs unless someone was deciding whether to make a problem official. Hale opened it simply. Walk us through the canyon. Start from the moment of initial detonation. She walked them through it. She was precise and sequential, and she did not editorialize. She described each intervention in clinical terms, the decision rationale, the sequence of triage. She did not downplay the difficulty of the conditions or pretend that everything had gone according to a plan, because there had been no plan for what happened in that canyon. There had been improvisation and speed and a very specific kind of learned desperation. When she finished, there was a silence that had several layers to it. Major Aldrich spoke first. A needle decompression in those conditions, in the dark, on a canyon floor, without imaging confirmation, that's a significant intervention to perform outside a surgical environment. Gallagher's breathing pattern was diagnostic. Absent breath sounds on the left, tracheal deviation beginning. The clinical presentation didn't require imaging. It's still a procedure that carries risk of leaving a tension pneumo unaddressed carries a 100% mortality risk, Major. The needle decompression carried considerably less. Aldrich looked at Hale. Hale's expression didn't change. Price, the S2, leaned forward. Captain Carter, some of the interventions you described, the chest seal modifications, the tourniquet sequencing on the bilateral casualties, the improvised surgical drainage on Peterson, those aren't standard nursing competencies. Where did you receive training in those techniques? She met his eyes. Advanced trauma life support, TCCC certification, and additional training I've received through various assignments. Which assignments? That information is in my personnel file. I've reviewed your personnel file. Then you know what's in it. A pause. I know what's in the portions that are accessible. She didn't respond to that. She held his gaze and waited. Price glanced at Hale. Something passed between them that she wasn't meant to see but saw anyway. Captain Carter, Hale said, no one in this room is questioning the outcome in the canyon. 17 casualties, 0 fatalities. That is an exceptional result under any circumstances. He paused. What's being questioned is how that result was achieved by a combat nurse operating outside the scope of any medical qualification visible in your record. The record shows what it shows, sir, which is exactly the problem. She said nothing. The JAG officer had still not spoken. He was writing something. She didn't try to read it. Hale leaned back. He looked, for the first time since she'd met him, like a man who was genuinely unsure of something. I'm going to request a full review of your service record through channels above my authority. That process is going to take time. In the meantime, you remain attached to this task force. Understood. I'm also removing you from field operations pending the review. She had expected that. Sir? That's not a punishment, Carter. That's a precaution. She stood when he dismissed her. She walked out of the debrief room and into the corridor and stood there for a moment with her back against the concrete wall and her eyes on the middle distance. From inside the room, through the door she'd pulled most of the way closed, she heard Aldrich say, "She's not going to tell us anything." And Hale, quieter, "No, she's not." The week that followed had a specific kind of tension to it, the tension of a thing that hadn't happened yet. Lena was restricted to the installation. She had access to the aid station, the operations center during planning sessions, and the training areas during off hours when they were empty. She was not invited to mission planning meetings. She was not consulted on medical preparation for the 2 smaller operations the task force ran that week, both low risk, both close to the installation, both returning without casualties. She noticed that Ewan was pulling her up on the radio before each of those operations, technically asking for medication, reconciliation, or supply checks. Actually, she understood, checking in, making sure she knew what was happening. "Pitterson's doing well," he said one morning over the radio, pretending to be confirming a supply count. "Drain held. They're saying he might be back on profile in 6 weeks. "Good," she said. "Gallagher's asking who did the chest decomp. Tell him it was you if it makes the paperwork easier." A pause. "He already knows it was you. He was awake." She didn't say anything to that. "He's been telling everyone," Ewan said. "For what it's worth." She thanked him and ended the radio call and went back to re-inventorying the aid station supplies, which she had already done twice that week and which did not actually need re-inventorying. Briggs found her in the aid station on day 11. She heard him before she saw him, boots on the concrete, a particular cadence she had catalogued early on, the walk of a man who covered ground efficiently and without apology. He stopped in the doorway, and she kept working, reorganizing the trauma kit she'd rebuilt after the canyon. "You need something, Sergeant?" He was quiet for a moment. The specific quality of quiet that was actually him deciding whether to say the thing he'd come to say. "Gallagher's wife called the installation," he said finally. He gave her the name of the medic who did the chest thing. She wanted to write a letter. Ewan was there too. He did good work. She asked for Carter, specifically. Lena set down the IV kit she was holding. "She doesn't need to send a letter. He's alive. That's the letter. She's going to send it anyway." A pause. "You should let her." She looked at him then. He was standing with his arms crossed, which on him was less aggressive than it was self-contained. The posture of a man who didn't know where to put his hands when he wasn't holding a weapon. "What do you want, Briggs?" He didn't answer immediately. He looked at the aid station, the organized trauma kits, the supply logs, the map of the canyon she'd tacked to the wall with 6 different routes, marked in different colors. "I want to understand what happened out there," he said. "I triaged 17 casualties and kept them alive until extraction." "That's not what I mean." She waited. "The drainage thing on Peterson, that's not something you learn in a nursing program." "No." "So where'd you learn it?" She held his gaze. "The portions of my file that aren't accessible to the S2. Something moved in his face. Not quite frustration, more like the recognition of a boundary he couldn't push through, and the reluctant decision to respect it. "They're going to keep digging," he said. "Price especially. He doesn't let things go." "I know. Whatever's in that file, if it's something that looks bad for you, you should probably have a plan." She almost smiled, not because it was funny, but because there was something genuinely human in the warning. Something underneath all the weeks of dismissal and the radio commentary and the job description jokes. He had come to the aid station on his own time to tell her to watch her back. "The file isn't the problem," she said. He frowned. "What is?" "What they decide to do when they see what's in it." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he unfolded his arms and straightened up in the doorway. "Gallagher wants to meet you, formally. He says thanking you over a radio doesn't count. Tell him when he's recovered. He'll hold you to that." "I know." Briggs left. She listened to his boots on the concrete receding down the corridor, and then she stood alone in the aid station with the canyon map on the wall and did not think about the personnel file and the clearances and what was going to come out of whatever Price had put in motion. She thought about Gallagher's wife and the letter she was going to write. She thought for a moment about what it meant to receive a letter like that. Then she picked up the IV kit and went back to work. Price caught up with her 3 days later, and he hadn't come alone. She was in the operations center reviewing terrain maps. She'd been given access to the map room as part of what Colonel Hale had framed as continuing medical integration, which she suspected was actually him giving her something to do while the review worked through its channels. Price came in with a man she hadn't seen before. Civilian clothes, mid-50s, the kind of unremarkable face that was specifically designed to be forgotten. He introduced himself as Warrant Officer Daniels, retired, currently working as a contractor with the Installation Security Division. Retired Warrant Officer, Civilian Contractor, Security Division. None of those three things typically combined into someone with a reason to be in a map room talking to a combat nurse on administrative hold. "Captain Carter," Price said, "do you have a few minutes?" She did. She was also not going to pretend she didn't know what this was. "Your personnel file came back with a partial response," Price said. He set a folder on the table. She recognized the format. Army Records Request, cover sheet, but the document beneath it was conspicuously thin for a file of her service length. The portions above my clearance were obviously not released, but there was a notation from the records office. He opened the folder to the relevant page and slid it across to her. She read it without touching it. The notation was administrative, dry, the language of bureaucracy performing the specific function of acknowledging a thing without explaining it. Records for the above-referenced officer include material held under Joint Special Access Authorization. Release requires concurrence from originating authority. Requests should be directed through appropriate channels. She slid it back. "Joint Special Access," Price said. "That's not a designation that appears on routine nursing assignment records." "No," she said. "It's a designation that appears on records for personnel who have conducted operations or received training under classified Joint Command authorities." "I'm aware of what it means." "Are you going to tell me which operations?" "No." "Captain, I'm not being difficult, Captain Price. I'm being precise. That information isn't mine to share. If the originating authority decides to release it, they will. If they don't, I'm not going to shortcut that process." The civilian, Daniels, spoke for the first time. His voice was flat and uninflected, the voice of a man who had spent a long time listening before speaking. "Captain Carter, the task force has personnel with TS/SCI clearances who have operated under special access authorizations. Joint special access is a narrower designation. It's typically reserved for operational compartments that cross service lines." She looked at him. "You've done your homework." "I try to." "Then you also know that the homework ends where the compartment begins." Daniels looked at her with something that might have been appreciation, the look of one professional recognizing another. "Fair point," he said. Price closed the folder. He was frustrated in the way that smart, meticulous people got frustrated when they hit a wall they couldn't dismantle with thoroughness. "What I'm trying to understand," he said, "is why an officer with that kind of classified background is here, attached to this task force, as a combat nurse." She met his eyes. "Maybe that's a question for the people who wrote my orders. I intend to ask them." "Good." She meant it. That's the right move. He blinked. He had expected resistance, and she had given him direction instead. The difference knocked him off his footing for just a moment. She gathered the map she'd been working with and stood. "Is there anything else?" "Not right now." "Then I'll be in the aid station." She was not, in fact, in the aid station. She was in her quarters, sitting on the edge of her bunk with the satellite phone she wasn't supposed to have. Strictly speaking, nobody had told her not to have it, but she understood implicitly that its existence was not something to advertise. She made a call. It connected after one ring, which was unusual and told her something. "Carter." The voice on the other end was familiar in the way that certain voices became familiar when they had given you orders in places with no good options. General Claire Voss, 3 stars, currently attached to a command she publicly held at the Pentagon and privately held somewhere more complicated. "Ma'am, I think you're about to receive an unusual records request." A brief silence. "We already have it." "How do you want to handle it?" "That depends." A pause that was professional rather than uncertain. "How bad did it get out there?" 17 casualties, 0 fatalities. Another pause, longer this time. That's not why I asked. I know. She shifted on the bunk. They're pulling the thread, ma'am. Price is sharp. He's going to get to the Joint Special Access notation and start making calls. He already has. One of his calls reached us. A pause. What's your read on the task force? Lena thought about this with genuine care. Hale is professional. He made a decision about me on day one, and he's revising it honestly, which takes more integrity than most. Briggs, she stopped. Briggs is more complicated. Complicated how? He's not a bad officer. He's an officer who had a fixed picture of what things should look like, and the canyon broke that picture. Whether he rebuilds it correctly is still an open question. And you? She looked at the photograph above the desk. The mountain. The country she would never name. I'm fine, she said. Voss let that sit for a moment in the way of someone who had heard those words from enough people to know what they usually covered. I'm going to decide what to do about the file in the next 48 hours. In the meantime, stay where you are. Don't confirm or deny anything. Understood. Carter. A pause. 17-0. Yes, ma'am. That's a number. It is. The line went dead. Lena put the phone away and sat for a moment longer in the quiet of her quarters, listening to the installation sounds, wind off the ridgeline, the distant diesel grind of a vehicle in the motor pool, someone's boot heels on the walkway outside her door. She thought about the canyon, not the work she had made her peace with, the way she always made peace with it. She thought about the moment just before the explosions, sitting in the back of the trailing vehicle with her kit across her knees, the feeling she'd had, the specific kind of attention she'd been paying to the walls. She had known something was wrong before she could have said what. That was the part she never put in debriefs. Not because it was classified, but because there was no clinical language for it. The accumulated weight of enough wrong situations that the body started registering them before the mind caught up. She had felt it in the vehicle. She had not said ambush incoming because she couldn't have justified that claim from observable data. But she had organized her kit in that specific sequence, that night, and not the standard sequence, and the specific sequence was the reason she'd been able to reach the hemostatic dressing for the neck wound in under 4 seconds in total darkness. That was not something she was going to put in any document. Torres found her in the range 2 mornings later. She went to the range in the early morning when it was unoccupied, not to shoot. She was on administrative hold, and the administrative hold technically covered range access. But because the range was the only outdoor space on the installation that had a covered shelter with a southern exposure, and in the mornings, when the sun cleared the eastern ridge and hit the shelter boards, it was the warmest place on post by several degrees. She was sitting in that shelter with a cup of coffee and her green notebook when Torres showed up, which meant he had either followed her or asked someone where she went in the mornings. She waited to see which it was. He sat down 2 feet away from her without asking, which told her it was the second thing. That someone had told him, which meant someone was paying enough attention to know her habits. He didn't say anything for a moment. He had the quality of a man who was more comfortable with silence than most people in his profession, which was uncommon enough that she noted it. Gallagher talked to me, he said finally, about the canyon. She turned a page in her notebook. Okay. He said you were talking him through it while you were working on other people, just your voice in the background, saying things. She had done that. It was a technique she'd developed a long time ago, maintaining verbal contact with casualties while managing multiple patients, the voice functioning as both reassurance and anchor, preventing shock cascade in patients who were conscious enough to hear but too badly hurt to respond. Keeps them from going too far inside themselves, she said. Torres absorbed that. He says he heard your voice and he knew he wasn't going to die, not because of what you said, just because of how you said it. She didn't say anything. I was one of the ones you used as medical support, Torres said. You pointed at me and said I was your runner. You were mobile and you moved fast. Good choice. I've never done medical support before. I didn't know how. You figured it out. You gave me clear enough directions that I didn't have to figure anything out. I just had to follow them. A pause. That's not nothing. Making it that simple when it's that complicated. She looked at him. He wasn't looking at her. He was looking at the range, the empty target frames 200 meters downrange, the way the morning light hit the backstop berm. "I was one of the ones in Briggs's vehicle," he said. "One of the ones who called you dead weight." "I know. I'm not—" He stopped. Restarted. "I'm not apologizing because I'm obligated to. I'm apologizing because I was wrong about a specific thing, and I want to say that clearly." "Accepted," she said, without ceremony, without the weight he seemed to expect her to put on it. He seemed mildly thrown by how easy that was. "What's in your file?" he asked. "Nothing I can tell you about." "Does it explain the canyon?" "Partially." He nodded slowly. "Price thinks you're some kind of intelligence asset running a cover. Price is creative. He's not wrong that you're not what you said you were." She closed the notebook. "I'm exactly what I said I was. I'm a combat nurse. That's not a cover, Torres. That's what I am. Other things happened before and alongside it, but the nursing is real. The medicine is real. Those 17 men are alive because the medicine is real." He looked at her then. His face had the specific openness of someone who had recently revised a significant assumption and was still calibrating to the new data. "What happens when Price's requests get answered?" he said. "Something will change." "For you?" "Probably for several people." He stood up, brushed something off his knee. "Briggs asked me to find out if you were okay. He didn't want to come himself because he thought it would come across wrong." She looked up at him. "Tell him I'm fine." "You actually mean that?" "I usually mean what I say." Torres made a sound that might have been a laugh briefly. He walked back toward the main installation. She watched him go, and then she sat for a while longer in the morning shelter with the sun warming the boards and the green notebook in her lap. And she thought about 48 hours. That was what Voss had said. 48 hours to decide what to do about the file. That window had already been open for 31 hours. The decision, when it came at night. Colonel Hale knocked on her quarters door at 2100. He knocked in a specific way. 3 knocks, a pause, one more, that she suspected he didn't realize was a pattern. Or, if he realized it, he didn't know it was the kind of knock people used when they had serious news and wanted to announce themselves that way. She opened the door. He was in uniform, which meant this was official. "You need to come with me," he said. She pulled her jacket on and followed him across the dark installation to the operations center. The lights inside were on, which at 2100 was unusual. The S2 was there, Aldrich, the JAG captain, and 3 people she didn't recognize, 2 in civilian clothes, 1 in a uniform that carried rank insignia she hadn't expected to see at a battalion-sized installation in Montana. 1 star, Brigadier General. The name tape read Forsyth. He looked at her when she walked in. She looked back. She had last seen Forsyth in a different country, in a building that no longer existed, at the end of an operation that had officially never happened. He had put 2 classified commendations in her record that she would never be able to publicly acknowledge. Now he was standing in an operations center in Fort Redstone, looking at her with an expression she couldn't fully read, which was unusual because she could read most things. "Captain Carter," he said, "General Forsyth." She heard behind her the sound of Price quietly putting his pen down. Hale's voice, careful. "You know each other?" Neither of them answered immediately. Forsyth's eyes moved across her face, not an assessment of how she looked, but an assessment of something harder to name, whether she was okay, whether the canyon had done something to her that didn't show on the surface. "We've worked together," he said finally. "In what capacity?" Price said. Forsyth turned to look at him. "In a capacity you don't have authorization to know." The room went very quiet. Forsyth looked at Hale. "Colonel, we need to talk about your medical attachment. I've been trying to get information about her record for 2 weeks." "I know." Forsyth moved to the head of the table. "I'm here because the information you've been trying to access has been authorized for a limited release." He set a folder on the table, thicker than the one Price had shown her, considerably thicker, and put his hand on top of it. "Before I open this, I want to be clear about the ground rules. What's in this folder is classified above the level of everyone in this room except Captain Carter and myself. I can tell you the summary. I cannot give you the detail. If you need the detail, the request goes through my office." Hale leaned forward. "Understood. Captain Lena Carter has served, concurrently with her nursing assignments, As a medical specialist attached to a classified Joint Special Operations Unit operating under authorities I'm not going to name in this room. Forsyth's voice was even, factual, the voice of someone reading a brief they'd given before. The nursing assignments are not cover. They're legitimate. She's one of the best combat nurses in the Army, and her records demonstrate that clearly. The additional assignments are classified. They involve medical operations in denied areas, environments where conventional medevac was not available, surgical intervention was required under fire, and the difference between success and failure was measured in how fast and how accurately a single practitioner could operate without support. He stopped, looked at the room. The techniques Captain Carter used in the canyon, he continued, were developed and refined over multiple years of those operations. The specific intervention she performed on Sergeant First Class Peterson is a variation on a procedure that was developed, tested, and first executed in a field environment by Captain Carter herself. Another pause. She didn't learn it somewhere, he said. She created it. The room was so quiet that she could hear the wind off the ridgeline through the operations center walls. Hale was looking at her, not with the expression he usually wore, the measured, controlled assessment of a commander evaluating a subordinate, with something closer to the way Gallagher's wife had probably written in that letter, the specific look of someone who had just understood that they had been holding something without knowing what it was. Briggs was in the back of the room. She hadn't seen him when she walked in. He was standing against the wall, arms crossed, in the specific posture she now understood meant he was containing something rather than expressing it. His face, in the light of the operations center, was doing something complicated. He had been in the canyon, too. He had held the light. He had carried men to her hands without being asked. She thought about what it cost a man like Briggs to stand in a room where his first 3 weeks of judgment was being dismantled in real time, in front of his colonel, in front of a general. She didn't look at him too long. That wasn't a kindness she needed to make a show of. Forsyth opened the folder, not to read it to the room, she understood that, but to slide one page across to Hale. She could see, from her angle, the header of the page. A citation, partially redacted. Certain names blacked out, certain locations, certain units, but the core of it visible. Specific language about leadership under fire, about lives preserved, about operations in environments where failure was certain and success was achieved anyway. Hale read it. He read it twice. When he looked up, his expression had finished changing into something she hadn't seen on him before. "Captain Carter," he said. "Sir, I owe you." He stopped himself, reframed. "The task force owes you a significant apology." She looked at him. "The task force owes me nothing, sir. 17 men are alive, that's what matters. It matters that they're alive, and it matters how they came to be alive. Those aren't mutually exclusive." She didn't respond to that. Forsyth was watching the exchange with the particular quality of attention of someone who had expected this conversation and was letting it happen without interruption. Briggs, against the wall, uncrossed his arms. That was the thing she noticed, not Hale's expression or Price's silence or Aldrich's sudden reassessment. Briggs, against the wall, quietly uncrossing his arms, the small, physical surrender of the posture he'd been holding since she'd walked into Fort Redstone 3 weeks ago. She noted it, filed it, did not make more of it than it was, but she did not make less of it either. Because in her experience, the people who were hardest to move were the ones whose movement, when it finally came, actually meant something. Forsyth stayed 2 days. In those 2 days, several things happened that she understood were consequential, even while they appeared, on the surface, to be administrative. He met privately with Hale for 3 hours the first morning. He met with the JAG officer. He reviewed task force medical protocols and wrote several pages of notes that he did not share with anyone in the room. On the evening of the second day, he came to the aid station where she was working and sat in the folding chair across from the supply table without being invited, which was his prerogative. "You could have called me sooner," he said. "I wasn't sure you'd come." "That's not fair." She looked up from the supply inventory. "No, it's not. I'm sorry." He accepted that. He picked up a tourniquet from the table and turned it over in his hands, the professional habit of someone who had spent time in environments where the quality of a tourniquet was not an abstract concern. "Voss tells me you're okay," he said. "I told her I was." "She says you usually mean what you say." "She's right." He set the tourniquet down. "The task force is going to be put in for a unit commendation." Your contribution is going to be cited in the commendation language. She thought about that. Publicly? As public as these things get. And the classified elements? Remain classified. He paused. But the canyon isn't classified. What you did in the canyon is documented by 42 witnesses and a battalion surgeon who has already put it in writing that the interventions were beyond exceptional. That part doesn't need a security clearance to acknowledge. She was quiet for a moment. What about the administrative hold, she said. He almost smiled. It was a small thing, barely visible. What administrative hold? She looked at him. As of 0800 tomorrow, he said, you're reinstated to full operational status with the task force. Effective immediately after that, Colonel Hale has a new standing medical protocol built around your skill set. You're no longer the attachment nobody asked for. A pause. You're the person they're designing the operation around. She absorbed that. There's something else, he said. She waited. The hostages, the 3 contractors the mission was supposed to recover. He said it carefully, in the way of a man navigating between what was true and what could be said. We got them out. A secondary element completed the recovery while the canyon situation was being managed. They're safe. She had not known that. In the chaos of the canyon and the evacuation and the debrief, nobody had told her the original mission outcome. She set down her pen. All 3? She said. All 3. She nodded once, said nothing. Forsyth stood. He looked at her across the aid station table, across the trauma kits and the supply logs and the canyon map still tacked to the wall with its 6 colored routes. I'm going to need to write something for the records office, he said, when the full authorization comes through. A summary of your operational contribution to this task force, on the record. She looked up. What do you want it to say? He was quiet for a moment. The truth, he said. For once. He left. She sat alone in the aid station with the sound of the ridgeline wind outside and the photograph above her bunk in the quarters next door and the green notebook open to a page she hadn't written anything on yet. She picked up her pen. She wrote 17. 0. She closed the notebook. Outside, the installation was doing its nighttime things. The distant diesel, the voices at the motor pool, a vehicle running its engine in the cold. Normal sounds, ordinary sounds. The sounds of a place that was continuing to function because the people inside it were still alive to make them. She turned off the aid station light. She did not yet know what was coming next, not in the specific operational sense, but she knew the shape of it, the way you knew the shape of terrain from a map before you'd ever walked it. Things were about to get considerably more complicated, and for the first time since she'd driven that gray Tacoma through the Fort Redstone gate 3 weeks ago, she found she did not mind. The morning Forsyth left, the installation felt different, not quieter. Fort Redstone was never quiet. The generators and the vehicles and the constant low-grade percussion of a working military installation saw to that. But there was a different quality to the noise, the way air pressure changes before a storm that hasn't arrived yet. People moved with a slightly altered awareness of her. She noticed it in the way she always noticed things. Not from direct eye contact, but from peripheral data. The supply sergeant nodded at her near the motor pool when he'd never acknowledged her before. 2 rangers from Briggs's team, passing her on the walkway, stepped to the right to give her room rather than the casual indifference of a month ago when she might as well have been a traffic cone. Small things. She didn't let herself build too much on them. She spent the morning in the aid station restocking what the canyon had consumed, methodical and thorough, cross-referencing the inventory against projected operational needs, with the specific attention of someone who had been burned before by assuming resupply would arrive when requested. UN came in at 0930 and wordlessly took over the blood products section of the inventory without being asked, which was its own kind of communication. They worked in comfortable silence for a while. General Forsyth, Ewan said eventually, not looking up from his count. That was unusual. Yes. A 1-star doesn't drive from wherever to have a 2-hour meeting with a battalion surgeon about blood product protocols. No, she agreed. He talked to you. He did. Ewan wrote something in his log. The operators are going to want to know what's happening. They'll be told what they need to know. That's not what I mean. He looked up. I mean individually. Gallagher, Torres, some of the others. They've been They're different now, after the canyon. They want to understand what they were part of. She thought about that. Tell them they were part of a very bad night that could have been worse. That's not going to satisfy Gallagher. No, she said. It won't. She was cleared for the afternoon planning session, her first since before the canyon. She took her usual seat near the back. Old habit and useful. You saw more from the back, and watched the task force filter in. Briggs came in with Torres and two others, took his regular seat at the center left of the table. He looked at her once when he sat down. No commentary, no editorial, just a look that measured something and then moved on. The planning session was for a reconnaissance mission. 3 days. High mountain terrain, minimal footprint. Lower risk than the canyon mission by every metric. But the S-3, a compact major named Reese who had a gift for understatement, flagged the medical component with the specific hesitancy of a man revising his professional assumptions in real time. Medical planning, he said, looking at his notes, then at her. Captain Carter, you want to walk us through the CCP positioning? She had not been asked to present anything in a planning session before. The room noticed. She could feel it. She stood. She didn't make a ceremony of it. She went to the map and she walked them through the casualty collection point logic for the specific terrain. Rock formation, wind direction, helicopter approach angles, the ridge sightlines that would affect medevac windows. She covered it in 6 minutes, concisely, and when she finished, she sat back down without waiting to see how it landed. Reese nodded. That's the most thorough medical component I've seen at a planning brief in 2 years. She didn't respond to the compliment because the compliment was for doing the job she'd always been doing, and she'd long ago stopped needing that acknowledged. But Hale, at the head of the table, wrote something on his legal pad. She didn't try to read it from across the room, but she could guess at the shape of it. The recon mission deployed and returned without incident 3 days later. She ran the medical preparation, traveled with the secondary element, managed 2 minor injuries that were more administrative than clinical, blisters and a wrist strain, the kind of thing that was almost insulting after the canyon, and was back at Fort Redstone by 1700 on the 3rd day. 2 hours after she returned, Colonel Hale pulled her into his office and closed the door. He didn't sit down, which was unusual for him. He stood behind his desk with his hands on the chair back, and there was something in his posture that she had learned to read in the weeks she'd been here. The particular tension of a man managing incoming information that required decisions he wasn't ready to make. I got a call this afternoon, he said. She waited. From the JAG Corps. Not Captain Fielding here, from the JAG office at Forcecom. He paused. Apparently the records authorization Forsyth initiated has triggered a secondary review process. The review involves looking at how your assignment to this task force was initiated, who approved it, and whether the classification protocols around your file were correctly maintained. She kept her expression even. Bureaucratic? Partially. He looked at her. There's also a flag from an IG office. Inspector General, Forcecom level. Someone submitted a complaint related to your assignment. What kind of complaint? The kind that questions whether a classified asset was placed in an operational role without proper disclosure to the receiving command. She absorbed that. Someone is arguing that I shouldn't have been here without the task force knowing what I was. That's the framing? Yes. Who filed it? I don't know. IG complaints have anonymity protections. He paused. But the timing and the specific framing, someone with knowledge of classified military assignment procedures filed it within the last 4 days. She thought about the room on the night Forsyth had done the limited disclosure. Who was in it? Who had enough procedural knowledge to frame an IG complaint correctly? Price. It was almost certainly Price. Not out of malice, she thought, out of the specific rigidity of a man who believed process was process and deviation from it required accountability, regardless of outcome. What does the IG review mean for my status here, she said. Nothing immediately. But if the review determines there was a disclosure failure in how you were assigned, it could create complications for the classified commendation Forsyth mentioned, for your operational status going forward, and he stopped. It could create complications for the command's liability around the canyon. Because if I wasn't properly disclosed, the interventions I performed could be questioned on authorization grounds. medical interventions on military personnel performed by a specialist operating outside her disclosed qualifications, the outcomes speak. The outcomes are not the legal question, Carter. He said it without heat, but firmly. The legal question is whether those interventions were authorized. And if the answer is that they were performed under a classified authority that the receiving command wasn't informed of, we've got a paperwork problem that a 4-star could have trouble untangling. She was quiet for a moment. She had known this was a possibility. Not this specific shape, but something like it. The way institutional systems sometimes turn their machinery on the things that had worked. Because working outside the expected parameters was its own kind of violation, regardless of what the working had produced. "Tell me what you need from me," she said. Hale looked at her. The office was quiet, the hum of the fluorescent light above them filling the space where he was deciding something. "Right now, nothing. The IG process is going to run its course. What I need is for you to keep doing your job and not do anything that gives the review additional material to work with." "Understood, Carter." He waited until she met his eyes. "I want to be clear. Whatever that review concludes, my view of what happened in that canyon hasn't changed. My view of you hasn't changed." A pause. "But I have a task force and a command structure to protect. And sometimes that means I can't say everything I think." "I know," she said. "I've worked in institutions before." Something in his face shifted, briefly. The recognition of a statement that carried more history than its surface. "Yeah," he said. "I imagine you have." Yes. The new mission package arrived at 0300. She knew it had arrived because the operations center lights came on. And within 7 minutes of the lights coming on, she heard the specific pattern of movement across the installation that meant something had changed. Doors, boots, the particular urgency of people who had been asleep and were no longer. She was already mostly awake. She slept lightly in field environments, a habit so old it had stopped feeling like a choice, and she was dressed and moving toward the ops center before anyone had formally summoned her. Hale was already there. So was Reese, and Price, and Briggs. The intelligence picture on the main screen was a new one, not the canyon target area. Further north, deeper into the mountain terrain, a different canyon system, a different ridgeline, fresh satellite imagery time-stamped 4 hours ago, and a hostage. Not 3 this time. 1. A signals intelligence analyst, civilian contractor, grabbed 48 hours ago from a survey site 60 kilometers north of the previous target area. The same militia organization or a connected cell. The intelligence picture wasn't definitive on the relationship. What was definitive was that the analyst had critical knowledge of infrastructure vulnerability data from the survey work, that the hostile actors holding her were aware of the value of that knowledge, and that the window for a clean recovery was measured in hours. "They're going to move her," Price said. He had a laser pointer, and he was tracing a route on the satellite image. "The cell has a vehicle pattern consistent with pre-movement preparation. If they load her into the terrain to the north, we lose visibility and likely lose the window." "How long?" Hale said. "Best estimate, 6 to 10 hours before they move. If we launch inside 3, we have a viable window." Hale turned to Briggs. "Team readiness." Briggs was already awake in the way that Rangers were awake. Fully, immediately, without the transitional period that most people needed. "We can be wheels up in 90 minutes. "Medical?" Hale looked at her. She had been studying the terrain imagery since she walked in. "What's the hostage status?" Price pulled up a secondary screen. "Limited data. She's ambulatory in the imagery from 6 hours ago. No information on injuries. Duration of captivity is 48 hours. Depending on conditions, she could be dehydrated, hypoglycemic, hypothermic given the nighttime temperatures in that terrain. If she's been restrained for any significant portion of that time, circulation issues are possible." She pointed at the terrain. "The exfil route. North or south?" "South. Same general area as the original mission, but this ridgeline," Reese traced it, "is different. 2 access roads, both viable. Secondary is a forestry service route that hasn't been assessed in the current season." She studied the forestry route, the elevation lines, the exposure. "Who assesses the secondary route?" she said. "That's a question for the ground element." "That's a question for me before the ground element gets there," she said. "What do the seasonal maintenance records show for that road?" Price blinked. "I don't... Seasonal maintenance records for Forestry Service roads are public data. The Forest Service logs maintenance windows and surface condition assessments. If that road hasn't been graded since September and we're looking at the current temperature pattern, the surface could be significantly different from the satellite imagery. Reese was typing. A few seconds later. Last maintenance logged October 3rd. Surface condition at that time moderate. Note flagged about drainage erosion near the 2-kilometer marker. Drainage erosion. Elevation. Temperature. That road washes out when the frost heave comes, she said. At current temperatures, the road surface is compromised above the erosion point. If you lose the south primary and go to the secondary, you're going to hit that erosion at the 2-kilometer marker and the vehicle will not clear it. The room was quiet. Hale said, "Recommendation? Add an engineer assessment to the ground element, or accept the south primary as your only exfil and build your contingency around holding the primary at all costs." Briggs was looking at the map. His jaw was doing the thing she'd cataloged. If we add an engineer element, we lose mobility. If you lose the secondary and can't hold the primary, you lose everything, she said. They looked at each other across the table. Not hostile, nothing like the first week. Just the specific tension of two professionals who had different training and different data and were trying to converge on the right answer under time pressure. "We hold the primary," Briggs said. "One element on the primary at all times. No split." "Then your security positioning needs to account for that commitment," she said. "You can't use the primary road element as a reserve." "Agreed." He said it without pause, which was its own small thing. "Reese, adjust the security positioning on the primary. 2 vehicles static, 1 mobile. Medical is with the static element." "I should be with the recovery element," she said. Briggs looked at her. "Hostage has been in captivity 48 hours, she said. "Her condition when they reach her is unknown. You want me at the point of contact, not waiting a kilometer back. The point of contact is the most dangerous position in the mission." "I know." "Carter, Sergeant Briggs," she said it evenly. "She's a woman who has been in someone's hands for 2 days in mountain terrain. When your men get to her, I need to be there. Not because I don't trust your team to render first aid, because the first 5 minutes of medical assessment in a recovery can determine outcomes for the next 48 hours, and that assessment needs to be done by someone who knows what they're doing." Briggs turned to Hale. Hale looked at her, looked at the map, looked at the ceiling for a brief moment that she understood was him running the calculation. "She goes with the recovery element," he said. "Briggs, adjust accordingly." Briggs nodded. He didn't argue. She marked that too. Not with satisfaction, but with the careful attention she gave to things that were changing in ways that mattered. They launched at 0530 in a 3-vehicle element with air assets holding 20 kilometers south, out of earshot. The weather was cleaner than the canyon night had been. Cold but dry. A full moon that was both useful and inconvenient, lighting the mountain terrain with the kind of pale clarity that made movement visible at distance. Lena was in the second vehicle, behind Briggs's lead element, ahead of the trailing security vehicle. She had reorganized her kit on the drive out, a different configuration than the canyon, because this scenario was different. Recovery operations had a specific medical profile: dehydration, hypothermia, restraint-related circulation problems, the particular psychological fragility of someone who had been in captivity and was not yet safe. She had thought about that profile and packed accordingly. Okonkwo was in the vehicle with her, the big sergeant from the canyon who had been her litter team leader. They hadn't spoken much since that night, but he had a quality she valued. He moved in the right direction without needing specific instruction, which was a rarer skill than most people recognized. "You've done recovery ops before," he said, about 30 minutes into the drive. Not a question. "Some. Different from the canyon?" "Different problems." He was quiet for a moment. "What's the worst part of it?" She thought about the question seriously, because it deserved a serious answer. "The moment between contact and extraction. When you found them and they know they're going to be okay, but they're not actually okay yet. That gap between knowing they're safe and being safe, that's when the body sometimes decides to stop compensating. Crash." Exactly. They hold it together under the stress because the body is remarkable at that. But the moment someone they trust shows up and says you're going to be fine, sometimes that's the thing that removes the last bit of resistance and they go into shock anyway. So you can't tell them they're going to be fine. You tell them they're going to be fine. You just also make sure your IV is already in before you say it. Okonkwo made a sound. Not quite a laugh, but adjacent to it. The vehicle turned off the main road onto the approach track. The terrain got rougher immediately. The driver, a young ranger named Kessler, who drove with the focused intensity of someone who took vehicle operation as seriously as marksmanship, adjusted his speed and said nothing. 15 minutes out, Briggs's voice came over the radio, clipped, precise. Sierra Elements, radio silence, we're in range, Shay. She clicked once to acknowledge, checked her kit for the final time. Bombed. The compound, when they reached it, was less compound than it appeared in the satellite imagery. She understood, approaching on foot through the tree line, that a lot of things looked more substantial in satellite imagery than they were in reality. What the imagery had shown as a structured encampment was, in person, 3 trailers and a generator shed arranged around a central clearing that showed signs of recent rapid occupation, tire tracks, equipment scars, the debris pattern of people moving in quickly and without much concern for long-term habitation. The militia cell was not here permanently. It was here the way people were somewhere when they were passing through it, which meant the timeline was even shorter than Price had estimated. She crouched in the tree line beside Okonkwo and watched the clearing. Briggs was 40 meters to her left with the main element. She could see his silhouette against the tree line, the particular stillness of a man managing the gap between preparation and action. The radio, extremely quiet. 3 tangos, trailer 1, 2 visible. 3rd estimated on the far side. Hostage, trailer 2, east end. She noted the distances. Trailer 2 was 30 meters from her position. The clearing between the tree line and the trailer was exposed. 20 meters of open ground with no intermediate cover. Briggs again, barely audible. On my mark. Lima element, you hold the east. Okonkwo, Carter, you move on the trailer 2 breach. Kessler on overwatch. She felt Okonkwo shift beside her, ready. Mark. Everything happened at once in the way that well-executed operations happen, which is to say, not smoothly, not perfectly, but fast enough that the gaps between things didn't have time to become disasters. The main element crossed the clearing at a controlled sprint. There were voices. The specific shout of a breach command, the crash of a door, 1 shot and then 2, all from the same weapon, both from the direction of trailer 1. She was moving before the echoes settled. She went across the clearing low and fast with Okonkwo half a step ahead of her, and the trailer door was already open. Briggs had sent someone ahead, she registered, because the lock was broken from the outside before she reached it. And she went through the door into a space that smelled of kerosene and sweat, and the particular staleness of a confined space with inadequate ventilation. The woman in the corner was named Sarah Chen. She knew that from the intelligence brief. And she was 34 years old, and she was alive. She was also in considerably worse condition than the satellite imagery had suggested. She had her hands zip-tied in front of her, not behind, which was a small mercy and had probably saved her hands from more serious damage. But she had been restrained at the wrists for at minimum 36 hours. The marks and swelling made that clear immediately. And she was shaking with the specific controlled shiver of someone who had been cold for a very long time and was only now allowing themselves to react to it. Her left eye was partially swollen. Not severe, not orbital fracture, but someone had hit her at least once with enough force to produce a hematoma over the cheekbone. She looked at Lena when Lena came through the door, and her expression did something complicated. The rapid sequential processing of threat assessment, recognition, hope, and the desperate effort not to collapse into any of those things too quickly. "You're safe," Lena said. "We're getting you out. My name is Captain Carter. I'm medical." A knife appeared, Okonkwo's, already open, and the zip ties came off. Lena caught both hands immediately, examined the wrist marks and the circulation in both hands, applied light pressure, and watched capillary refill. "Squeeze my fingers." She squeezed, both hands, weak but present. "Good. Can you stand?" "Yes. I think yes." She stood and her legs didn't fully cooperate on the first attempt. Okonkwo was there without being asked, the steadying hand, and she got upright with the particular determination of someone who had decided that collapsing was not something they were going to do in front of strangers. "I can walk," she said. "I know you can. Walk when you're ready." Lena was already doing the rapid assessment, Visual, tactile, verbal, the entire sequence compressed into the 90 seconds before they needed to move. Hypothermia was real, but manageable. The wrist circulation would recover. The eye would heal. Dehydration was significant. Skin turgor, lip condition, vocal quality all pointed the same direction. She got the IV in on the second attempt. The first stick missed, which she noted with clinical detachment, the vein mobile and difficult in the cold, and had a flush going before they moved. "You're going to feel this in about 4 minutes," she said, of the fluid. "Don't be alarmed when you feel warm." Chen looked at her. "How long have you been doing this?" "Long enough." "You do this often? Canyon rescues and—" "Ma'am, we need to move." "Right." Chen straightened. "Right. Let's go." They were out of the compound and back in the vehicles within 9 minutes of breach, which was well within the timeline. The air assets came south when Briggs called them in, the helicopters clearing the ridgeline in the cleaner night air with no weather complications. And the extraction proceeded with the unremarkable efficiency of a well-executed plan that had not been disrupted by the things that disrupted plans. Lena sat in the helicopter with Sarah Chen and monitored the IV, and ran through the secondary assessment with the kind of focused attention that excluded everything that wasn't the patient in front of her. The radio noise, the rotor noise, the adrenaline metabolizing in her own system into a slightly shaky aftermath that she controlled by keeping her hands occupied. Chen was a precise woman, analytical. She asked specific questions in a specific order: where they were going, what medical facility, who would debrief her, how long the debrief would take. She was reassembling herself in real time, reconstructing the routine and structure that captivity had disrupted, and Lena watched this process with the professional interest of someone who understood that recovery started in the first hour, and what happened in that hour mattered. "Your eye," Lena said. "When did that happen?" "First day. I argued about something." A pause. "I should have waited to argue." "What were you arguing about?" "Whether I was going to cooperate." A brief, flat smile that hurt her eye, and she didn't stop it. "I was not." "Good decision, ultimately." "Felt like a bad decision at the time." She looked at Lena. "You were in the canyon, the operation that went wrong last week. It wasn't a question. News moved through intelligence communities in specific ways." "Yes," Lena said. "I heard there was a nurse that she—" Chen stopped, looked at her more carefully. "You." Lena rechecked the IV rate. "How's your hand feeling?" "Warmer." A pause. "Thank you for both. The canyon and this." "You don't need to—" "I know I don't need to." Her voice was tired but precise. "I'm saying it because it's true." Lena sat with that for a moment. Outside the helicopter door, the Montana mountains were moving past in the moonlight, the ridge lines catching the pale light and throwing it back, the high country doing its indifferent thing. "The men in the canyon," Chen said, "all of them made it?" "Yes." "That's—" she exhaled. "That's something." They landed at Fort Redstone at 0440. The installation was lit up. Word had traveled ahead. And there were people on the pad when the helicopter set down. Medical team from the installation, Aldrich from the battalion surgeon's office, a civilian in a dark jacket who was almost certainly from the FBI's hostage recovery unit and who moved toward the helicopter with the controlled urgency of someone who had been waiting for this specific moment. Lena helped Chen out of the helicopter and handed her, smoothly, to the installation medical team. The specific handoff of a practitioner releasing care to a higher-level facility, giving the receiving team her assessment findings in the compressed, precise language of medicine. And then she stepped back as the institutional machinery took over. Chen looked back at her once, over the shoulder of the receiving medic. Lena nodded. Chen nodded back. That was all. But Briggs found her 40 minutes later, on the helipad perimeter, where she was sitting on a concrete barrier with her kit across her knees, running through a post-mission inventory. It was 0520. The sun was not yet up, but the sky to the east had the specific pale quality that meant it would be soon. He sat beside her without invitation, which by now she had come to understand was simply how he moved through spaces he'd decided he had permission to occupy. "Clean up," he said. "Yes." Chen's being seen at the medical station. Aldrich says she's in better shape than expected. She held herself together well. He was quiet for a moment. She kept working through the inventory. I watched you in the trailer, he said. The way you ran that assessment. 4 things at the same time, in 90 seconds, in the dark. Standard recovery protocol. It's not standard. I've done 10 of these in the last 3 years. I've never seen it run like that. She didn't respond. You do it the same way every time, he said. The canyon, the planning brief, the trailer, the same way. Like there's a sequence and you know exactly where in the sequence you are. She stopped what she was doing and looked at him. Dawn was coming in across the ridgeline and the light was in that specific transitional state. Not dark, not light. The color of something that hadn't decided yet. That's what training does, she said. No. He shook his head slowly. Training gets you to the sequence. What you have is past the sequence. You're in the sequence, and you're also above it, watching it run, adjusting while you're in it. She looked at him. It was, she thought, one of the more accurate descriptions she'd heard from someone who hadn't done what she'd done. Where did you learn that? He said. Places I can't tell you about. I know. He was quiet. I know you can't. I'm not asking you to tell me. He paused. I'm asking because I want to understand what I was dismissing when you got here, what I was actually writing off. She turned back to her kit. A combat nurse. No, that's what it said on the paperwork. The paperwork isn't wrong. The nursing is real. I know it is. That's not... He stopped, started again, with the particular effort of a man who was not practiced at this kind of conversation. I owe you an apology, a real one. Not the kind you say because someone tells you to say it. She was quiet. I made a decision about you in the first 10 minutes, he said. I decided I knew what you were and what you were capable of, and I stopped updating that picture even when the data told me I was wrong. That's not good soldiering. That's not good anything. She let a moment go by. I know, she said. I know you know that. Is that... He paused. Is that it? What else do you want? He seemed to genuinely consider the question. I don't know. I thought this would be harder. I don't have energy for hard. She closed the kit. I have energy for useful. You made a mistake in assessment. You corrected it under fire, literally. You held a light in the canyon for 4 hours. You adjusted your mission planning tonight without arguing. She looked at him. That's the apology. What you did after you were wrong is the apology. He sat with that. The sun finally broke the eastern ridgeline, the first direct light hitting the helipad in a long, cold slant. She picked up her kit and stood. Get some sleep, she said. Brief is at 10:00. Yeah. He stood too, looked at the sunrise for a second. Carter. She looked back. The call sign, he said. The one in your file. Forsyth mentioned it. Guardian Angel. She didn't say anything. It's a good one, he said. She walked back toward the installation and did not respond to that, because the call sign had been given to her by someone who was no longer alive to give call signs to anyone, and that was a weight she carried in a way that didn't need acknowledgement to be real. The morning was cold and the installation was waking up around her. The generators, the vehicles, the voices, the ordinary machinery of a place full of people who were still alive to make noise in it. She carried her kit back to the aid station. She wrote 2 lines in her green notebook. She made coffee. She did not yet know that the IG review had, overnight, been elevated to a formal investigation, or that the officer who had filed the original complaint had added a second filing that expanded the scope from disclosure procedures to questions about the authorization of her classified assignments going back 3 years. She did not know that the formal investigation had triggered, at the Forcecom level, a review request that had landed on General Voss's desk at 0200 that morning. She did not know that Voss, upon reading it, had picked up a phone and called a number that connected her to someone with 4 stars on his collar, and that the conversation had been brief and had concluded with the 4-star saying, in a tone that left no room for procedural ambiguity, "Then I'll come myself." She found out about all of this at 1000, when Colonel Hale walked into the aid station with an expression she had not seen on him before, something between controlled and something it wasn't yet fully controlling, and said simply, "There's a vehicle at the gate." She looked at him. "Who is it?" He held the door open. Through the aid station window, she could see, across the installation, a convoy of 4 vehicles that had not been on the morning schedule. Black. Government plates. Moving toward the operations center with the unambiguous authority of people who had not asked permission to arrive. General Harlow, Hale said. She knew the name. Everyone knew the name. 4 stars. Chairman of the Joint Chiefs Senior Operational Advisor, a man who did not drive 4 hours into Montana for administrative reviews. Why is he here? She said, though she already understood the answer. Hale looked at her with the expression of a man who had just realized that the thing he thought was a command problem had turned out to be something considerably larger. I think, he said carefully, that someone has decided this isn't going to be handled quietly. The convoy did not hurry. That was the first thing she noticed. 4 vehicles moving at a measured pace through the installation. No urgency in the speed, no flashing lights, nothing that signaled emergency. Just a deliberate, unhurried procession that was somehow more authoritative than urgency would have been. People who moved fast were reacting. People who moved like this had already decided. She and Hale walked out of the aid station together and crossed the installation toward the operations center. The morning was still early enough that the long shadows of the ridgeline covered half the parade ground, and the convoy pulled in front of the operations center and stopped in those shadows, 4 vehicles in a line, engines cutting one after another with the kind of coordination that spoke to practiced movement. The man who got out of the 3rd vehicle was not what most people expected when they imagined 4 stars. General Harlow was 61, compact, and moved with the economy of someone who had long ago stopped performing authority and simply inhabited it. He wore his uniform without decoration beyond the rank insignia and a service ribbon stack that told anyone who knew how to read it that he had been in every significant operational theater of the last 30 years. His face was weathered in the specific way of someone who had spent more time outside than inside, and his eyes, when they found her across the distance of the parking area, did the thing that certain eyes did, the rapid, thorough assessment that looked casual and was anything but. He walked directly to her, not to Hale, to her. Captain Carter. General Harlow. He looked at her for a moment, not unkindly, not appraisingly, but with the specific attention of a man taking inventory of something he'd been thinking about from a distance. You look like you've had a long night. Recovery operation, sir. We got her out. I know. I got the brief on the drive up. He paused. All of them, the canyon and this one. She waited. Inside, he said. Not a question. The operations center had been cleared. She didn't know when that had happened, sometime between Hale appearing at the aid station door and now, but when they walked in, the room held only Harlow and 2 of the people who had come with him, plus Hale, and to her mild surprise, Forsyth, who had apparently turned around somewhere on the highway south and driven back. Forsyth looked at her when she came in. She read something in his face that she hadn't seen there before, a tension that was not quite worry, but was in the neighborhood. Harlow sat at the head of the table. He did not invite anyone else to sit, so nobody did. He set a folder on his table that was considerably thicker than the one Forsyth had brought. Not records, operational documentation, from the weight and format of it. She recognized the cover sheet designation from across the table and kept her expression neutral. The IG complaint, Harlow said, without preamble. You know about it. Colonel Hale informed me of the original complaint and the escalation. The second filing expanded the scope. You're aware of that. As of this morning, yes, sir. The second filing alleges that personnel operating under classified Joint Special Access Authorities were placed in operational roles without proper disclosure, that the disclosure failure was intentional, and that the outcomes of those operations, specifically the Canyon incident, may have been achieved through methods that were unauthorized under the receiving command's operational parameters. She let the language settle. Someone is arguing that saving 17 lives was procedurally irregular. Someone is arguing that how you saved them wasn't authorized. He paused. There's a difference. A technical one. In the Army, Captain, technical differences are frequently the ones that matter most. She didn't argue with that. It was true. Harlow looked at Hale. Colonel, before I go further, what's your assessment of Captain Carter's contribution to this task force? Hale didn't hesitate. She identified a critical supply deficiency before we deployed that would have materially affected our casualty treatment capacity. She flagged the exfil route vulnerability in the Canyon mission planning brief. In the Canyon, she established and managed a field casualty station under fire, in freezing conditions, without adequate medical supplies, and maintained 17 critically wounded operators until extraction. 0 fatalities. In last night's recovery operation, she conducted a complete medical assessment and initiated treatment on the hostage within 90 seconds of contact. She has integrated into this task force's medical planning in a way that has materially improved our operational medical posture. He paused. She is the best medical asset this task force has operated with in 3 rotations. Harlow looked at her. And what does the person who filed the IG complaint know that your colonel doesn't? She understood the question's architecture. He wasn't asking her to reveal classified information. He was asking her to characterize the gap between what was visible and what was hidden. They know that certain techniques I used in the Canyon came from training and operational experience that isn't documented in my disclosed record, she said. They're arguing that using those techniques in an operation I was assigned to as a combat nurse constitutes operating outside my disclosed authorization. Is that a fair characterization of what happened? It's an accurate one. Whether it's fair depends on how you weigh the authorization question against the outcome. 17 men. Yes, sir. Harlow was quiet for a moment. He opened the folder. He didn't read from it. She understood he had already read it, but he turned to a specific page and set it flat on the table so that its header was visible to the room. She recognized it. She had not seen it since it was written, 5 years ago, in a building in a country that no longer appeared in her conscious geography of places she admitted to having been. Joint Operational Medical Authority, the header read. Below it, a series of designations and a signature block. She knew whose signatures were in that block without being able to read them from where she stood. This document, Harlow said, grants specific medical personnel the authority to perform interventions up to and including surgical-level procedures in operational environments under classified joint authority, regardless of their disclosed qualification level in any individual service component. He looked at her. You've operated under this authority for how long? 7 years, sir. And the authority was in effect during the Canyon incident? Yes. So the argument that your interventions were unauthorized is incorrect, she said. The authority exists. It's classified, but it exists. The question the IG complaint is actually raising is whether Colonel Hale's command should have been informed of that authority before I was attached. Should they have been? She paused. This was the harder question. The standard practice for placements like mine is to inform the receiving command that the medical attachment has enhanced capabilities without specifying their source or scope. That notification should have happened through the orders package. If it didn't happen, that's a process failure, but it's not my failure. It's an administrative failure at the level above the one that wrote my orders. And who wrote your orders? She looked at Forsyth. Forsyth said, My office coordinated the orders, General, under General Voss's direction. Harlow looked at him, a long, level look. So the disclosure failure, if there was one, originates in your office. Forsyth didn't flinch. That's a fair reading, sir. That's also why you're here. Yes. The room was quiet in a particular way. The quality of quiet that existed when the accountability was landing somewhere specific and everyone in the room understood exactly where. Harlow closed the folder. The IG complaint is going to be resolved. I'm not going to tell you how, because how it gets resolved involves processes above this installation's concern. What I will tell you is that the resolution is not going to find that Captain Carter acted improperly. The authority existed. The interventions were covered. The outcomes speak to the quality of the judgment. He looked around the room. What the complaint has done, however, is create a documentation problem. And that problem needs to be addressed. How? Hale said. By doing what should have been done before Captain Carter arrived here, Harlow said. By informing this command properly and fully of who and what they have attached to their task force. He looked at her. Which means, he said, that we're going to have a conversation about your record. All of it. The parts that are accessible and the parts that aren't. Today, in this room, with Colonel Hale present and cleared for the duration of this briefing. She felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. Not relief. It wasn't simple enough for that. Something more complicated, the specific sensation of a weight that had been carried in one position for a very long time being repositioned. Not removed, just carried differently. Understood, she said. The briefing took 3 hours. She had been in briefings that covered her record before, but always in rooms that were already cleared to the relevant levels, with people who had the context to understand what they were being told. Giving it here, to people for whom significant portions of it were genuinely new, was a different experience. She watched Hale's face as Harlow and Forsyth walked through the sections, the joint unit, the operational theaters, the specific missions, the techniques she had developed and the lives those techniques had saved, and the classified commendations that could never appear in her public record. Hale's face did not do the thing she might have expected, the theatrical revelation, the dramatic recalibration. It did something more contained and therefore more meaningful. He listened with the particular focused attention of a man doing serious revision, updating his picture of something with data that required actual rearrangement rather than just addition. And when the briefing concluded and the room went quiet, he sat with it for a moment before he said anything. "Why a nurse?" he said finally. Genuinely, with everything in that record, why the nursing cover? Forsyth started to answer and Hale raised a hand. "I'm asking her." She had been asked this before. The answer was always the same because it was always true. "It's not a cover, sir. I said this to someone else and I'll say it again. The nursing is real. I went to nursing school before any of the classified assignments happened. I did it because I grew up watching people get hurt and not be able to fix it, and I wanted to fix it. Everything else came later. The classified assignments came later. But the nursing was first, and the nursing was mine. And I didn't want to give it up just because I was also doing other things." Hale absorbed that. "The nursing is also useful," she said. "In the environments where I operate, a combat nurse is less visible than a special operations medical specialist, less threatening, less likely to be treated as a high-value target. Less likely to be taken seriously," he said, quietly. "Not as an accusation, as a recognition." "That too," she said. "Sometimes." He looked at her for a long moment. "I owe you a direct apology, Captain. Not just acknowledgement, not just updated paperwork. I made decisions about your capability and your value in the first minutes after you arrived, and I communicated those decisions to my command in ways that shaped how every operator here treated you for the first 3 weeks." She waited. "That was wrong," he said. "Not strategically wrong, just wrong." He paused. "I'm sorry." The room was very still. She said, "I appreciate that, Colonel." It was enough. She meant it. Harlow stayed through the afternoon. He had a second meeting, just him and Forsyth, in Hale's office with the door closed. She didn't ask about it and wasn't invited to it, which she understood was about the orders package and the disclosure failure and what Forsyth's office was going to produce by way of corrective documentation. She went back to the aid station. She was restocking a trauma kit when Price appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a moment in the specific way of a man who had decided to do something and was making a final check of his commitment before he did it. He was holding a folder. She could see her name on the tab. "Captain Carter." "Captain Price." He came in, set the folder on the supply table. "I filed the IG complaint." "I know." He blinked. "You knew?" "I suspected. The procedural framing of it was specific enough that it had to come from someone with JAG, adjacent training, and a working knowledge of classified assignment disclosure protocols. There were 3 people in that room the night General Forsyth briefed us. You were the most likely." He was quiet for a moment. "I want you to know it wasn't personal. I know that too. The disclosure failure was real. I still think it was real." "It was real," she said. "Forsyth's office is addressing it." "I know. General Harlow's people told me." He paused. "I'm not going to withdraw the complaint. The process should run. I'm not asking you to withdraw it." "You're not angry?" She looked at him. "You identified a genuine procedural problem. You used the correct channel to raise it. The fact that you used it to raise something involving me doesn't make it wrong to have raised it." She paused. "It would have been helpful if you'd come to me first, but you didn't have enough information to know whether coming to me first would have been appropriate." Price looked at the folder on the table. "I've been S2 for 2 years, In that time, I've processed a lot of records requests. I've never seen a joint special access notation on an assignment record for someone at the O3 level. No, she said. You probably haven't. It was anomalous. Yes. You understand why I flagged it? Yes, Captain. I understand why you flagged it. And if I'd been in your position, I might have done the same thing. She picked up the folder and held it out to him. Your records request triggered a disclosure process that was overdue. That's not nothing. He took the folder, held it. The techniques in the canyon, he said. The surgical drainage, the chest decompression, I looked those up after the briefing. I know you did. The variation you used on Peterson, I couldn't find it in any published protocol. You wouldn't find it in a published protocol. Because you developed it. Because the environment where it was needed didn't allow time for the standard approach, and something had to work instead. He looked at her with the expression of someone recalibrating a significant data set. You invented a surgical procedure in the field. I adapted an existing procedure under field conditions. That's different. Is it? She considered. Not much, she admitted. He almost smiled. It didn't quite make it all the way to his face. General Harlow is going to recommend a formal commendation, public record, the canyon, the recovery operation, the full assessment of your contribution to this task force. I heard. How do you feel about that? She thought about it seriously. Like it's the right administrative outcome and also like it doesn't change anything that actually matters. What actually matters? She looked at the trauma kit on the table. Whether the next time is better than the last time. Gallagher came to the aid station that evening. He was moving carefully, the chest still tender, ribs doing what ribs did when they'd been stressed badly enough. But he was upright and mobile, and the color in his face was good. He had his arm in a partial sling that she suspected was more for his team's peace of mind than medical necessity. He stood in the doorway and looked at her the way people sometimes looked at you when they had been unconscious for a significant portion of an important event and were trying to construct the full picture from fragments. You put the needle in, he said. Yes. I was awake for it, barely. I remember the sound. The hiss. Yeah. He came in and sat down in the chair across from the supply table. I remember your voice, before that. You were talking to someone else and I could hear you. That's intentional, she said. Auditory anchor for conscious casualties. I didn't know what you were saying, half of it. I just heard the tone. She set down what she was doing and looked at him properly. He was a big man, and right now he was a big man who looked like someone who had been through something and was processing it with the specific honesty of someone who didn't have much patience for pretending. My wife wrote you a letter, he said. Ewan mentioned. She's going to mail it regardless. I told her you said it wasn't necessary, and she said... He paused. She said that's exactly the kind of person who needs to receive a letter. Lena looked at the window. The mountain outside was doing its evening thing, the light changing in degrees down the granite face. Tell her I'll read it, she said. Yeah. He shifted carefully, accommodating the ribs. I was one of the ones who called you dead weight. I know. I didn't say it to your face. I said it to Briggs. I heard it. I know. He was quiet. I don't have a sophisticated way to say I was wrong. I was wrong. Briggs already apologized for the team. Briggs apologizes for himself. I apologize for me. He looked at her steadily. I want you to know that I know what I owe you. Not... He stopped. Not in a way I can repay. I know that. My kids know my face because of you. My wife... He stopped again. I know what I owe you. She held the weight of that for a moment. You don't owe me anything, she said. That's not a deflection. I mean it structurally. I was doing my job. You were doing yours. In the canyon, those were the same job. Not everyone would have done what you did with that job. No, she admitted. Not everyone. So it matters that you did. She looked at him. His face was open and tired and completely without performance, and she thought about the canyon floor and the hiss of the decompression needle and the specific responsibility of being the person who was still standing when other people couldn't be. It matters, she said. You're right. It matters. He nodded. That was enough for both of them. He stood, carefully, and she stood too, and he offered his right hand. Not the arm, the hand, the formal one, The one that meant something specific. And she shook it. "Best nurse I've ever had try to kill me," he said. She looked at him. "The needle," he said, "felt like being stabbed." "You were being stabbed, precisely and therapeutically." He laughed, a short, careful sound that cost him something in the ribs and was completely worth it from the look on his face. "Yeah, okay." He moved toward the door, stopped. "Briggs is different since the canyon. I don't know if you've noticed." "I've noticed. He's been talking to the younger guys about assessment, about how you look at people." He paused. "He doesn't say your name when he does it, but everyone knows who he means." She didn't say anything. "Just thought you should know," Gallagher said. He left. The formal session with General Harlow happened the following morning at 800 in the Operations Center with the full task force assembled. Not a briefing, not a debrief. Something that sat in a different category. The kind of institutional moment that happened rarely and was therefore weighted with the specific gravity of rarity. She stood at the front of the room because Harlow had asked her to, which she found mildly uncomfortable, and she watched the Rangers file in and find their seats. Briggs came in with his team and took the center-left position, his usual seat, and his eyes found her once, and he gave her a brief nod, the contained, professional acknowledgement of someone who had said what needed to be said in private and didn't need to perform it in public. Harlow stood without notes. He told them what he could tell them, in the direct language of a man who had been doing this long enough to know that military personnel didn't need things wrapped. He told them that Captain Carter had served in classified operational environments for 7 years concurrent with her nursing career. He told them that the techniques she'd used in the canyon had been developed and tested in conditions similar to, and in several cases, considerably worse than, what they'd experienced. He told them that her assignment to Task Force Ironclad had been appropriate and authorized, and that the administrative questions around disclosure had been identified and were being corrected. He told them about the 17. He said it simply. 17 casualties, 0 fatalities, in conditions that should have produced a significantly different number. That result exists because of one person's knowledge and one person's decisions and one person's refusal to allow a different outcome. The room was quiet. That person was treated during her first 3 weeks at this installation as a support attachment with limited operational value. He paused. That assessment was incorrect. The Army asks its personnel to evaluate capability accurately and revise that evaluation when the evidence requires it. This task force is going to do that, formally and on the record. He picked up a document from the table. Lena recognized it as a formal letter of commendation. The format was standard, but the header indicated FORSCOM level, which was not standard for a battalion-sized operation. He read it. She listened to her own name and her own actions rendered in official language and felt the specific peculiarity of hearing something true about yourself said formally and publicly, which was a different sensation than knowing it privately. When he finished reading, he set it down and looked at her. "Captain Carter, on behalf of the Army and this command, thank you." She said the only thing you said in that moment. "Thank you, General." He looked at the room. Dismissed. The operators stood. She stood. And then something happened that she had not expected and hadn't been told to expect. Gallagher stood up first, and then Torres beside him, and then Okonkwo. And within 4 seconds, the entire task force was on its feet, not at attention, not in formation, just standing, in the specific way that people stood when they were choosing to. And Gallagher started it, and then the whole room followed, and it lasted for a moment. That was not very long in clock time, and felt like something else entirely in the other kind of time. She kept her face straight. It cost her something she didn't have a name for. Briggs was the last one to stop. Price found her an hour later, which meant he had done something in that hour because he would not otherwise have been moving quickly. "There's a secondary outcome to the IG review," he said. He looked, she thought, like a man who had spent the last 18 hours reassessing a significant number of things and was still mid-process. The review identified 2 other cases in the last 3 years where personnel under Joint Special Access assignments were placed in receiving commands without proper disclosure. She had suspected this. Who? "I can't tell you names, but the pattern exists. The disclosure failure wasn't isolated to your orders package. It was systemic. General Forsyth's office was managing multiple placements under similar conditions, and the disclosure protocol had drifted from the standard. What happens to the other cases? Review process. Same as yours, but they don't have a canyon outcome to anchor the resolution. He paused. General Harlow is going to recommend a systemic fix to the disclosure protocol. Going forward, receiving commands will be informed of enhanced authorities at the time of assignment, under appropriate classification. She looked at him. Your complaint triggered that. He seemed to be deciding how to hold that information. Yes? That's not nothing either. He was quiet for a moment. I've been doing this job for 2 years, he said. I've never flagged something that came back this way. Complicated. Very. He paused. I'm not going to pretend I feel entirely good about how it landed. No, she said. But you should feel good about the part where the system worked the way it was supposed to work. That part's yours. He looked at her with the expression she was starting to recognize as his version of recalibration. The specific face of a man whose categories were being rearranged against his preference and his will. The commendation language, he said. Harlow's office asked me to contribute to the supporting documentation for the official record. What did you write? He almost looked embarrassed. The truth, he said, for what it's worth. Yep. Voss called that evening. She was on the helipad perimeter again. The concrete barrier, the southern exposure, the habit she'd developed. When the satellite phone rang. I heard it went well, Voss said. It went. Harlow called me afterward. He said you handled it with a great deal of grace. I handled it like a person who was tired and wanted it to be over. A pause. That's what grace looks like most of the time, Carter. She looked at the ridgeline. The sun was in its late afternoon position, the shadows getting long again, the mountain doing its perpetual thing. There's going to be a formal proposal, Voss said. It's going to come through official channels, so it'll feel less like a conversation and more like paperwork, but I wanted to tell you first. She waited. The classified unit you've been attached to, the Operational Medical Authority, the Joint Special Access work, there's a formal proposal to expand that program, more practitioners, formalized training pipeline, which means someone has to build the training pipeline. She understood the direction before Voss finished. They want me to design it, she said. They want you to design and run it, not just advise, run it. Your name on the program, your curriculum, your training methodology. A pause. You'd hold the rank of major under the restructured program. Formal, public command authority. She was quiet for a long moment. The nursing, she said, part of the program. You'd be training combat nurses with the enhanced medical authority built in from the start. No more classified addendum, no more dual track, just practitioners trained the way you were trained, but openly. She thought about the 7 years, the dual track, the weight of carrying 2 identities through environments where both were real and neither was complete. She thought about Gallagher's wife and the letter she hadn't read yet. She thought about Peterson and the procedure she had created on a canyon floor because the standard approach required tools she didn't have and time she didn't have, and she hadn't been willing to accept the alternative. I'll need to think about it, she said. I know. Take the time. A pause. For what it's worth, the 17 is part of why this proposal exists. Someone at the 4-star level looked at that number and decided it should be reproducible. It's reproducible, she said. It's just not easy. No. Voss's voice was something she couldn't fully categorize. Nothing you've ever done has been easy. After the call, she sat for a while with the phone in her hands and the ridgeline going from orange to gray in the fading light. She thought about the training program, about what it would mean to build something that lasted beyond any individual assignment, beyond any specific operation, beyond the specific problem of one person being in the wrong place with the right skills. She thought about the people she could train, not to be her, that wasn't the point and never had been, but to understand what she understood about the gap between what medicine could do in perfect conditions and what medicine had to do when conditions were never perfect. She opened the green notebook. She wrote for 20 minutes without stopping, not story, not diary, but structure, framework, the bones of something that didn't yet have a name. When she stopped, there were 3 pages of handwriting and the beginning of something that felt like the first genuinely new thing she had built in a long time. She closed the notebook. She sat until the light was fully gone, and the installation sounds were the nighttime ones, but quieter, settled, the generators and the distant vehicle, and somewhere the sound of operators running PT in the dark, because that was what they did. She thought about Hale's apology, Briggs's apology, Gallagher's handshake. She thought about Price and his IG complaint, and the uncomfortable, necessary rightness of a system that had eventually, imperfectly, corrected toward the truth. She did not think these things were resolution. She had been around long enough to know that resolution was a story structure, not an actual thing. What they were was a shift, the specific, permanent shift of a situation that had changed state and could not go back. Things that could not go back were the only kind of change that lasted. She stood up from the concrete barrier and picked up her kit and walked back toward the aid station. Because there was a trauma kit that still needed restocking and the morning's operational status report needed her medical input. And UN had left a note about the blood product inventory that required a response. She had been right, weeks ago, when she told Hale she knew what she was. She was a combat nurse. Everything else was also true. But the nursing was first. The nursing was hers. And tomorrow, and the day after, and for as long as she was breathing and upright and able to put her hands on the problem in front of her. That was what she was going to keep being. Inside the aid station, on the supply table, a sealed envelope sat next to the trauma kit. Her name on it, in handwriting she didn't recognize. A stamp from Billings, Montana. A return address she didn't know. She stood at the table and looked at it for a moment. Then she sat down and picked it up and opened it. The letter was 3 pages, handwritten on plain white paper in the kind of careful, deliberate script of someone who had started over more than once before committing pen to page. She read it without stopping. Gallagher's wife, her name was Dana, she learned on the first line, had written it the morning after her husband called from the installation hospital. She had written it at the kitchen table at 5 a.m. while their 2 kids were still asleep, and she said that in the letter because she wanted Lena to understand the specific quality of that hour. The dark kitchen, the coffee going cold, the kind of quiet that sits over a house where children are sleeping and a husband has just come home alive when he might not have. She did not write beautifully. The sentences were sometimes clumsy, and she crossed out 2 words on the second page and wrote them differently, and then crossed those out too and left both versions visible. She wrote about the first time her husband had deployed and the specific education of waiting, and she wrote about the moment the phone rang and the specific education of hearing his voice instead of something else. She wrote that she didn't know how to thank someone for a thing that couldn't be measured, and she wasn't going to pretend she did. She wrote that her kids would grow up knowing a name, Carter, and knowing what that name meant even if they never fully understood how. At the bottom of the 3rd page, in slightly different ink, like it had been added later. I know you probably hear this from a lot of people, and maybe it doesn't land the same way after a while, but I want you to know it's the first time I've ever written a letter like this, and I hope I never have to write another one, because that would mean my husband came home safe every other time too. Lena set the letter down on the supply table. She sat with it for a moment. Then she folded it carefully along its original creases and put it back in the envelope and put the envelope in the inner pocket of her jacket against her sternum where she kept things she needed to not lose. She did not cry. She had gotten past the point where things like this made her cry. Not because they stopped mattering, but because the mattering had gone somewhere deeper than tears a long time ago, into the part of her that ran the calculations and kept moving and did the next thing. She pulled out the green notebook. She wrote, Dana Gallagher, 5 a.m., kitchen table, both versions visible. She closed it and went back to the trauma kit and finished the restock she'd started 3 hours ago. The formal decision about the training program came through official channels 6 days later, in the form of orders that were not phrased as a question, which was how the Army usually communicated things it had already decided. She was in Hale's office when he handed them to her. She read them once, quickly, and then sat with them for a moment. Major. The program was called the Joint Operational Medical Training Initiative, a name that was entirely accurate and entirely without imagination, which was also how the Army named most things that mattered. She would be based at Fort Redstone initially, transitioning to a permanent facility at a location still under assessment. She would design the curriculum. She would select and train the first cohort of practitioners. She would hold full operational authority over the program's medical protocols, which meant that for the first time, nothing she trained people to do would require a classified addendum to explain. How do you feel about it? Hale said. She considered. Like it's the right thing, and also like it's going to be very hard. Most right things are. Yes. She set the orders on his desk. I'm going to need Ewan. He blinked. Ewan is assigned to this task force. I know. I'm going to need him anyway. He's the best medic I've worked with in 3 years, and the curriculum needs someone who understands field medicine from the practitioner side, not just the theory side. Hale looked at her for a moment. Then he picked up his pen and wrote something on his legal pad. I'll put in the request. No guarantees. I'll take the request. He looked at the orders on his desk. Forsyth's office released an updated statement to the IG review yesterday. Full acknowledgement of the disclosure protocol failure, corrective action plan, timeline for implementation. A pause. The complaint has been resolved as a systemic procedural finding rather than an individual misconduct finding. I know, Price told me. How are you with that outcome? Price did the right thing with what he had. The system ran the way it should. Nobody got scapegoated. She paused. I'm fine with it. Hale looked at her with the expression she had come to understand was his version of saying something he didn't have the right words for. You're a more forgiving person than I would be. I'm not forgiving, she said. I'm just not spending energy on things that resolved correctly. He almost smiled. There's a distinction there that I'm going to have to think about. Take your time, she said. You're good at thinking. He looked mildly surprised by that, then carefully, thank you. It's accurate. She stood. Sir? Carter. She looked back. For what it's worth, he said, this task force is better for having had you here. Not because of the canyon, not because of the commendation, because of what you changed in how these men think about who stands next to them. He paused. That's going to outlast the paperwork. She held that for a moment. So will the canyon, she said. Yes, he said. It will. Best said. She found Briggs at the range. Not shooting. He was there the same way she was sometimes there, using the covered shelter for the morning light. He had a cup of coffee and a map that he was annotating in pencil, and when she sat down 2 feet away from him, he moved the map slightly to give her room, which was its own kind of language. They sat in silence for a while. Orders came through, she said eventually. I heard. Harlow's program. Yes. He was quiet. She watched him make a small notation on the map in the precise, minimal handwriting of someone who had filled out a great many maps and learned to be economical about it. You're going to take it, he said. Yes. Good. He said it without sentiment, which was the right way for him to say it. It's the right move. I think so. He made another notation. The disclosure fix they're implementing. The new protocol. Informing receiving commands of enhanced authorities at assignment. What about it? I think about what it would have been like if we'd known. At the start. He paused. I don't know if it would have changed how I treated you. She looked at him. I'd like to say it would have, he said. That if I'd known what was in your file, I would have... He stopped. But I've been trying to be honest with myself about this, and I'm not sure the information would have done it. I think what did it was the canyon, watching you work. That's what changed the picture. People are like that, she said. Most people. The data doesn't move them as much as the direct experience. Is that a problem with people? She thought about it. It's a problem with assumptions. The assumption that what you already know is sufficient. The assumption that the category tells you everything about the individual inside it. She looked at the range. You stopped assuming in the canyon. That's not a character failure, Briggs. That's a training failure. The training told you certain categories of people belonged in certain roles, and you followed the training until the training stopped being useful. The training should have been better. Yes, that's what the program is for. He looked at her. Something in his face shifted. The specific shift she had seen a few times now. The revision still happening, still in process. You're going to be good at it, he said. The training. Not because you know the material, because you know how to see what other people are doing wrong without making them feel like they can't fix it. She didn't say anything for a moment. Gallagher said something similar, she said, about how you've been talking to the younger operators. Gallagher talks too much. He talks the right amount. She stood. What are you teaching them? He was quiet for a moment. I've been telling them about a specific cognitive error, where you look at someone and you see the category instead of the person, and you make all your subsequent decisions based on the category. He paused. I've been telling them it's the most dangerous kind of wrong, because it feels like knowledge. She picked up her coffee. Good lesson, she said. He nodded. She walked back toward the installation. She heard him, behind her, make one more annotation on the map. Her last evening at Fort Redstone, she sat in the aid station and wrote in the green notebook for a long time. Not the training curriculum. She had started that on a separate pad, already 12 pages of structure and sequence, and the specific architecture of what she wanted to build. What she wrote in the green notebook was different, less structured, more like the act of putting something down before it got away from her. She wrote about the canyon, not the clinical version, not the debrief version, but the actual version, the smoke and the cold, and the specific texture of working in the dark when you could feel people dying and you were the only thing standing between them and it. The way the canyon walls had thrown her voice back at her. The way Briggs had held the light for 4 hours without being asked. She wrote about Dana Gallagher's letter and the 2 crossed-out words, and what it meant to write something that imperfect to a stranger about something that mattered that much. She wrote about Price and the specific integrity required to flag a thing even when flagging it made you the uncomfortable person in the room. She had not liked what he did. She respected what he did. Those were not the same thing, and both of them were true. She wrote about Forsyth and the disclosure failure and the administrative drift of a system that had been trying to do the right thing and had gradually, without intention, stopped doing it correctly. Systems did that. People did that. The correction wasn't the failure. The failure was not catching it sooner, and the correction was the system working. She wrote, at the bottom of the last page she had space for, the nursing was first. The nursing is mine. Everything else is what I did with the nursing. She closed it. Ewan came in at 2,100. She hadn't told him about the orders yet. She had been planning to in the morning. But he stood in the aid station doorway with the expression of someone who had already heard. Torres, she said. Torres, he confirmed. You're going to want to be angry at Torres for about 4 minutes, and then you're going to want to talk about the program, she said. He came in and sat down. You're taking me with you. I'm requesting you. Hale put in the paperwork today. It's not guaranteed. What are the odds? Better than average. Harlow's office is involved, which tends to make things move in a specific direction. Ewan was quiet for a moment. He was looking at the trauma kit, the rebuilt, restocked, meticulously organized trauma kit that they had worked on together for weeks now. I've been a medic for 6 years, he said. I've never worked with anyone who... He stopped. You make me better at this. I don't mean that as flattery. I mean it as a technical observation. I am measurably better at this job for having worked alongside you for the last month. That's what the program is supposed to do, she said, systematically. So I'd be part of building that. You'd be the field expertise component. I have the theory and the classified operational background. You have 6 years of working with operators in real conditions, knowing what works and what sounds good in a classroom and falls apart in the field. I need both of those things. He was quiet for a moment more. What if the request doesn't come through? Then I find someone else with your skill set and spend 6 months teaching them everything I'd have taught you. She paused. But it would be a worse program. He looked at her. You know, most people in your position wouldn't be that honest about the contingency. Most people waste energy being diplomatic about things that are true. He almost laughed. Yeah. He stood. I'd want to go, if the paperwork comes through. Good. Now go get some sleep. I need you functional in the morning. He walked to the door and stopped. The canyon case study. Do you think it'll be part of the curriculum? She thought about the canyon, about the specific decisions she'd made in the specific sequence she'd made them, and why each one had been the right decision and what had almost gone wrong with 2 of them. Everything I've ever done is part of the curriculum, she said, including the parts that didn't go right. He nodded. He left. Morning formation on her last day was not a ceremony. She had specifically asked Hale not to make it a ceremony, and Hale had respected that. She packed her vehicle the way she'd unpacked it, methodically, kit first, then personal gear, then the green notebook. The photograph above the desk came down last. She looked at it for a moment. The mountain, the country she would never name, the landscape of a deployment that officially hadn't happened. She tucked it between 2 pages of the notebook. She drove the gray Tacoma to the formation area and parked it and walked to where the task force had fallen in for the morning brief. Standard morning brief. Nothing special in the agenda. Reese ran through the day's training schedule and the logistics updates and the communications maintenance window, and when he was done, Hale said nothing ceremonial. He just looked at her briefly, at the end, and gave her a nod that contained everything the ceremony would have said. She nodded back. After the formation broke, operators moved past her in the ordinary, purposeful way of people who had training to get to and things to do. Several of them made eye contact. A few gave her the abbreviated nod that in military culture functioned as a complete sentence. Something like, "I see you and I respect what happened," and "good luck," all compressed into the angle of a head. Gallagher appeared at her vehicle while she was loading the last bag. "Safe drive," he said. "Safe operations," she said back. He stuck out his hand. She shook it. His grip was stronger than it had been a week ago. The chest healing, the body rebuilding at the rate bodies rebuilt when they were young and otherwise sound. "The program," he said, "when it's running. If you ever need operators to come through it, I'll put in the request," she said. "Through Hale?" "Through whoever has you assigned." She paused. "You'd be good in the room. The younger ones would benefit from hearing what the canyon was like from your side of it." He looked at her. "What would I tell them?" "Tell them about the voice," she said. "Tell them what it meant to hear a voice and know from the tone of it that you weren't going to die." He absorbed that. Something moved in his face that he didn't try to control. "Yeah," he said. "Okay." She put the last bag in the vehicle. Closed the tailgate. Torres was across the parking area, loading something into a transport vehicle, and he raised a hand without looking up, which was its own kind of goodbye. The shorthand of someone who had said what needed to be said and didn't need to re-say it. Price was near the operations center when she drove past. He raised a hand too, more formal than Torres, less easy. She raised one back. She thought, he did the right thing with what he had. She had meant that. She still meant it. Briggs was at the main gate. She hadn't expected that. He was standing outside the guard post with his hands in his jacket pockets, and the particular stillness of someone who had specifically positioned themselves to be there and didn't want to make a production of it. She stopped the vehicle. He came to the window. "You didn't have to do this," she said. "I know." He looked at her the way people looked at you when they were finished performing and were just being a person. "The men you saved, Peterson, Gallagher, all of them. They're going to be in the field again in a few months. They're going to have teammates who weren't there. Those teammates are going to learn from them about what happened in the canyon." "Yes, and some of what they learn is going to be about you, about what you did and how you did it." He paused. "That's a different kind of training program, and it's already running." She held that. "Take care of yourself out there," he said, "wherever out there ends up being." "You too, Briggs." He stepped back from the vehicle. She looked at him once more in the rearview mirror as she pulled away. A man standing at a gate, watching a vehicle go, in the specific posture of someone who had revised something fundamental about how they understood the world and was still working out what came next. She drove through the gate. Montana opened up around her, the long road south, the mountains doing their perpetual indifferent thing, the sky above them the particular shade of blue that only existed at elevation on cloudless mornings. She drove for 20 minutes without thinking. Then she pulled over at a wide point in the road where the mountain dropped away to the west, and you could see for 40 miles in the clear air, ridge after ridge descending into the distance. She sat there with the engine running and the heat going and the heater ticking against the cold. She took the envelope out of her jacket pocket. She read Dana Gallagher's letter one more time, slowly this time. All 3 pages, including the 2 crossed-out words that she still couldn't fully read but didn't need to, because what they meant was visible in the fact that they existed, in the trying and the revision and the decision to send it anyway, imperfect and human and completely real. She put it back. She opened the green notebook to a clean page. At the top she wrote JOMTI, Curriculum Framework, Draft 1. Below that, the first line of the first section. The practitioner's primary obligation is to the patient in front of them. Every piece of training that follows serves that obligation. Nothing else. She wrote for 30 minutes in the cold car on the side of a Montana road, the mountains going blue in the morning light, the notebook filling up with the beginning of something that was going to take years and be difficult and occasionally go wrong before it went right. When she stopped, she looked at what she'd written. It was a start. Not the start she would have chosen, maybe. Not this particular road. Not this particular notebook. Not the specific path through the canyon and the debrief room and the formal commendation and Dana's letter and Briggs at the gate. But it was the start she had, and it was real, and it was hers. She closed the notebook. She put the vehicle in gear. She drove south through the mountains toward the next thing, carrying the weight of 17 men who were still alive and the weight of a letter from a woman she had never met, and the weight of a training program that didn't yet fully exist, and the lighter, simpler weight of knowing, finally and completely, that she had always been exactly what she said she was, a combat nurse. Everything else was what she'd done with it. The most powerful person in any room is not the one who demands to be seen. It's the one who stays and works and refuses to let anyone die until the room finally learns to look.